My name is Nathan, and today I'm going to tell you about the day God spoke to me in a hospital room, the day that shattered every belief I'd built my life on, the day an ex-atheist was born. But to understand that day, you need to understand who I was before it. You need to understand the man who mocked God, who dismissed faith as delusion, who was absolutely certain there was nothing beyond the material world. But before I continue, if this story intrigues you or challenges you, please subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment about your own journey with faith or doubt. Your story matters, and it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. I was a neuroscience researcher at UCLA, 38 years old, published in prestigious journals, respected in my field. My work focused on consciousness, how the brain creates the experience of being human. And my conclusion, backed by years of research and data, was simple. Consciousness is nothing more than neurons firing. The soul is an illusion. God is a comforting myth humans created to deal with mortality and meaninglessness. I wasn't just an atheist. I was militant about it. I debated Christians online, dismantling their arguments with logic and science. I wrote articles for atheist publications, explaining how belief in God was intellectually untenable. I gave talks at universities, teaching students that faith was the opposite of reason. Religion is a virus of the mind, I'd say in my lectures. It spreads through fear and ignorance, and the cure is education and rational thinking. My colleagues loved it. My atheist friends celebrated me. I was doing important work, freeing people from superstition, helping them see reality clearly. But I wasn't just intellectual about my atheism. I was angry, bitter even, because I'd grown up in a deeply religious household. My parents were evangelical Christians who believed the Bible was literal truth. They homeschooled me to protect me from secular lies. They took me to church 3 times a week. They prayed over every meal, every decision, every concern, and I hated it. Hated the rigidity, the judgment, the way they seemed more concerned with doctrine than with people. When I was 18, I went to college and never looked back. Cut off contact with my parents, rejected everything they'd taught me, and spent the next 20 years building a life that proved God was unnecessary. I was successful, respected, accomplished. I had a career I was proud of, colleagues who admired me, a life built on reason and evidence. I didn't need God. I'd proven that God didn't exist, and I was happy, or so I told myself. December 10th changed everything. I was driving home from the university, running late because of a department meeting that had gone too long. It was raining. That heavy Los Angeles rain that turns highways into chaos. I was distracted thinking about a research paper I was writing, barely paying attention to the road. I didn't see the truck run the red light, didn't have time to react. Just the sudden impact, the sound of metal crushing, the sensation of spinning, and then darkness. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital room, tubes everywhere, machines beeping, pain so intense I couldn't think clearly. A doctor standing over me, explaining in careful, measured tones that I'd been in a coma, that I'd sustained severe injuries, that I was lucky to be alive. Lucky, I thought bitterly. What luck was there in this? The next week was a blur of pain and medication and surgeries, broken ribs, collapsed lung, internal bleeding they'd had to operate on twice. The doctors said I'd recover, but it would take months, maybe longer. My colleagues sent flowers and cards. Thinking of you. Get well soon. We need you back in the lab. Generic well wishes from people who cared about my work more than they cared about me. No visitors, though. I didn't have family, not anymore. I'd pushed them away 20 years ago. I had colleagues, not friends. Acquaintances, not community. I'd built my life around ideas, not relationships. Around proving I was right, not connecting with people. And now, lying in a hospital bed, unable to move without pain, I felt the crushing weight of isolation. One evening, about 10 days after the accident, I was lying awake at 2 a.m. The medication made sleep impossible. Either I was unconscious or wired, no in between. The hospital was quiet except for the beeping of machines and the occasional footsteps in the hallway. I was thinking about my research, about consciousness, about the papers I'd written explaining how the self was an illusion, how free will didn't exist, how meaning was something humans invented to cope with meaninglessness. And suddenly, those ideas that had seemed so intellectually satisfying felt hollow, empty, because lying in that hospital bed in pain and alone, those ideas offered nothing. They explained consciousness maybe, but they didn't help me deal with suffering. They didn't give me any reason to recover. They didn't offer any comfort in the isolation. If consciousness was just neurons firing, then my suffering was just chemical reactions, meaningless, random. My pain was just signals in a brain that would eventually stop firing and then cease to exist. My entire life, all my research, all my accomplishments, all my certainty would simply end. No purpose, no meaning, no point. I'd believed this for 20 years, had built my career on it, had mocked people who needed more than this cold, materialistic view. But now, facing my own mortality, facing my own suffering, I realized how insufficient it was. If this is all there is, I whispered into the darkness, then what's the point? Why recover? Why endure this pain? Why fight to get back to a life that's just a temporary arrangement of atoms that will eventually dissolve into nothing? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt doubt. Not about atheism specifically, but about whether my worldview was actually adequate, whether it could actually sustain a human life through suffering. I thought about my parents, about the faith I'd rejected so completely, about how, when they'd faced difficulties, they'd prayed. They'd believed there was meaning in suffering. They'd trusted that their lives had purpose beyond just biological survival. I'd mocked them for it, called it weakness, delusion, intellectual cowardice. But now I wondered, was it cowardice, or was it wisdom I'd been too arrogant to recognize? God, I said into the darkness, surprising myself. Just the word felt foreign, uncomfortable, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. God, if you're there, if you exist despite everything I've said and written and believed, I need to know. Because if this is all there is, if my worldview is right, and there's nothing beyond neurons and matter and meaninglessness, then I don't know why I should keep fighting. I felt ridiculous. A neuroscientist talking to a God he didn't believe in. A man who'd spent 20 years explaining why prayer was just talking to yourself. But I was desperate, and desperate people reach for things they've rejected. I waited. For what? I didn't know. A voice, a feeling, some sign that I wasn't just talking to myself. Nothing came, just the beeping of machines and the silence of a hospital at night. I closed my eyes, feeling foolish and alone. But something was about to happen. Something that would demolish everything I thought I knew about reality. Something that would turn the militant atheist into a humbled believer. The day God spoke to me in the hospital was coming, and I had no idea how completely it would change everything. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a nurse checking my vitals. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window, and for a moment I'd forgotten where I was. Then the pain reminded me. Sharp, insistent, unavoidable. "Good morning, Dr. Reeves," the nurse said cheerfully. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I was hit by a truck," I said, because I was. She smiled sympathetically while adjusting my IV. "Your pain medication is due in about an hour. Can you hold out until then?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without showing how much it hurt. After she left, I lay there thinking about my prayer, if you could call it that, from the night before. In the daylight, it seemed even more absurd. A neuroscientist praying, a man who'd spent 2 decades explaining why prayer was neurologically just self-talk, reaching out to a God he didn't believe in. What had I expected? A booming voice from the ceiling, a miraculous healing, some supernatural sign that would overturn everything I knew about how the universe worked? Of course, nothing had happened, because there was nothing there to respond. I'd been talking to myself, just like I'd always known prayer was. The desperation of 2 a.m. had given way to the rationality of morning. I was embarrassed by my moment of weakness. This was exactly what I'd warned against. How suffering makes people vulnerable to religious thinking. How pain and fear make us reach for comforting illusions. I wasn't going to fall into that trap. I was a scientist. I dealt in evidence and reason, not emotion and desperation. But the question from last night lingered. If my worldview was right, why was I fighting to recover? Why endure months of pain and rehabilitation to return to a life that was ultimately meaningless? I pushed the thought away. Depression was normal after trauma. This existential questioning was just my brain processing the accident. It would pass. Around mid-morning, a hospital chaplain knocked on my door. A woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. "Dr. Reeves? I'm Chaplain Margaret. I visit patients who might appreciate some company or conversation. Would you like me to come in, or would you prefer privacy?" Every instinct said to send her away. I'd dealt with chaplains before, well-meaning people peddling comfort through superstition. I didn't need their prayers or their platitudes, but I was so desperately lonely, and she was offering conversation, not conversion. "You can come in," I said, "but I should tell you up front, I'm an atheist, a neuroscientist. I don't believe in God." She smiled and sat in the chair beside my bed. "That's perfectly fine. I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm just here to sit with you if you'd like company." Something about her tone disarmed me. No agenda, no judgment, just presence. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 11 days. "Since the accident. Any visitors?" "No, I don't really have. I work a lot. My family and I aren't in contact. That must be hard, being here alone." I felt unexpected tears forming. When had I become so emotional? I chose this. I chose to prioritize work over relationships. I chose to cut off my family because I disagreed with their beliefs. This isolation, it's what I built. But you're recognizing it now. That's something. We sat in silence for a moment. Then I said, "Can I ask you something? As a chaplain, as someone who believes in God, how do you reconcile suffering? If there's a loving God, why does he allow this kind of pain?" That's the question everyone asks, and I don't have a neat answer for you. But I've noticed something after 20 years of hospital chaplaincy. The people who suffer well aren't the ones who have answers. They're the ones who have presence, someone to walk with them through the pain, community, connection, love. But what about meaning? If life is just random chance, accidents happening to people who didn't do anything to deserve them, what's the point of any of it? You're asking big questions, Dr. Reeves. Questions I don't think I can answer in a way that would satisfy a scientist. But maybe the answer isn't intellectual. Maybe it's experiential. Maybe meaning isn't something you figure out. It's something you experience in relationship with others and with God. But I don't believe in God. I know. You told me. But you're asking questions that suggest you're open to something beyond what you've believed. And that's okay. Doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it's part of the journey. After Chaplain Margaret left, I felt strangely unsettled. Not convinced of anything, but not quite as certain in my certainty either. She hadn't tried to convert me, hadn't given me arguments or apologetics. She'd just listened, been present, offered connection without demanding I believe anything. It was disorienting. That afternoon, my doctor came by with an update on my recovery. "The good news is you're healing well. The surgeries were successful. With physical therapy, you should make a full recovery." "How long?" 4 to 6 months. Maybe longer. These kinds of injuries, they take time. "And my work? When can I get back to the lab?" "That depends on you. Physically, probably 3 months minimum. But Dr. Reeves, I'd encourage you to take the full recovery time. Don't rush back. Your body needs to heal, and so does..." He hesitated. "So does what?" "I've seen a lot of trauma patients. The physical injuries heal, but there's often psychological impact that takes longer. Consider talking to someone. A therapist. It can help. After he left, I felt defensive. I didn't need therapy. I was fine. This was just a physical injury. I'd heal and return to my life, and everything would go back to normal. But even as I thought it, I wondered, did I want everything to go back to normal? Back to the isolation, back to the emptiness that felt so stark now that I couldn't hide behind work. That evening, I had another visitor I didn't expect. Dr. Patricia Chen, a colleague from the neuroscience department. We'd published 2 papers together, debated materialist philosophy over coffee, attended the same atheist meetup group. "Nathan, I heard about the accident. I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner. I've been at a conference. How are you? Been better, but alive?" We talked about department gossip, about the research I was missing, about papers that were in progress. Normal conversation, comfortable, familiar. Then she said something that caught me off guard. "I've been thinking about you a lot since I heard about the accident, about how fragile everything is, how quickly life can change. It made me think about our research, about consciousness being just neural activity, about how when your brain stops, that's it, nothing beyond. That's what the evidence suggests," I said carefully. "I know, and I've believed it for years. But Nathan, when I thought you might die, when they said you were in a coma and they didn't know if you'd wake up, I found myself hoping there was more, hoping that consciousness doesn't just end. And I realized something. I don't want my worldview to be true. I want there to be something beyond neurons and matter. I want there to be meaning. Wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. I know, but doesn't it tell us something that we want it? That we hunger for meaning, even when we believe there isn't any? Maybe that hunger itself is evidence of something. Or maybe it's just evolution. Maybe we evolved to seek meaning because it aided survival, even if the meaning is illusory. Maybe, but maybe not. I don't know anymore, Nathan. This scared me, made me question things I thought I was certain about. After she left, I lay in the darkness thinking about her words, about how trauma makes us question our certainties, about how the hunger for meaning might itself be evidence of something beyond materialism. But evidence of what? And why should I trust feelings and intuitions over data and logic? Around midnight, unable to sleep again, I found myself thinking about my parents, about their faith that I'd rejected so completely, about how they'd faced difficulties in their lives, my father's job loss, my mother's cancer scare, with a peace I'd never understood. I'd called it delusion, avoidance, inability to face reality. But what if it was something else? What if it was access to resources I didn't have, connection to something I'd cut myself off from? I thought about that desperate prayer from the night before, about how I'd asked God to make himself known if he existed, about how nothing had happened. But maybe I was looking for the wrong thing. Maybe God didn't speak in booming voices or miraculous signs. Maybe he spoke in other ways, through chaplains who showed up offering presents without agenda, through colleagues questioning their certainties, through the hunger for meaning that wouldn't be satisfied by materialism. "God," I said again into the darkness, "I don't know if you're there. I don't know if I'm just talking to myself. But if you are there, if you do exist, I need you to show me. Not in some way I can explain away or rationalize, but in a way that's real, undeniable, true. I've spent 20 years explaining you away, building my life on the certainty that you don't exist. If I'm wrong, if I've been wrong all along, I need to know. Because this worldview I've built, it's not enough. It explains consciousness, but it doesn't help me live. It tells me what things are made of, but it doesn't tell me what they're for. I'm not saying I believe. I'm not saying I'm ready to accept faith over reason, but I'm saying I'm open. For the first time in 20 years, I'm open to the possibility that I might be wrong, that there might be more than matter and neurons and chemical reactions. Show me, please. If you're there, show me. I waited in the silence, not really expecting anything, just putting the request out there. being honest about my doubt and my hunger and my desperate need for something more than the emptiness my world-view offered. The room was quiet. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Outside, Los Angeles hummed with late-night traffic. And then, in the silence, I felt something. Not a voice, not a vision, just a presence. A sense of not being alone. A warmth that had nothing to do with room temperature and everything to do with being seen, known, held. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, maybe less. Then it faded, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it, if it was just the medication or the trauma or my desperate brain creating the experience I wanted to have. But something had shifted. A crack in my certainty, a door opening that I'd kept locked for 20 years. I didn't believe yet, didn't have faith, didn't accept the existence of God. But for the first time in 2 decades, I wondered if I might be wrong. And that wondering changed everything. The experience from the night before haunted me. In the rational light of day, I could dismiss it. Medication, trauma, my brain creating what I needed to feel. Neuroscience had perfectly good explanations for religious experiences. Temporal lobe activity. Endorphins, the brain's pattern-seeking tendency creating meaning where there was none. But the experience itself had felt so real, so distinct from anything I'd felt before. Not imagined or created, but encountered. As if something, someone, had been present in that room with me. I tried to push it away, focus on recovery, on the physical therapy that started that morning, painful exercises to rebuild strength, to prevent atrophy, to begin the long road back to normal functioning. But the experience lingered, a question mark where there had been certainty, a crack in the foundation I'd built my entire adult life on. Chaplain Margaret returned that afternoon. "How are you feeling today?" "Confused," I said, surprising myself with honesty. "Something happened last night. After you left, after my colleague visited. I prayed again, not because I believe, but because I'm desperate. And I felt something, a presence, like I wasn't alone in the room." "What do you think it was?" "Rationally, probably medication, or my brain creating what I needed. I know the neuroscience of religious experiences. I've written papers about it. The brain is perfectly capable of generating feelings of transcendence, of presence, of connection to something beyond ourselves." "But," she prompted, "but it felt different. Not like something my brain created, like something that encountered me, something outside myself." I shook my head. I sound insane. A neuroscientist claiming he experienced something his own research says doesn't exist. Or maybe your research has been asking the wrong questions. Maybe the fact that the brain has mechanisms for experiencing the transcendent doesn't mean the transcendent isn't real. Maybe those mechanisms exist because there's something real to experience. That's circular reasoning. You're assuming what you're trying to prove. Maybe. Or maybe you're so committed to your materialist assumptions that you can't recognize evidence that contradicts them. Tell me, Dr. Reeves, if God did exist, and if he did want to make his presence known to you, what would that look like? What would convince you? I thought about it. I don't know. Nothing, maybe. Because anything I experienced, I could explain materialistically. Any feeling, any experience, any evidence could be interpreted as brain activity rather than divine encounter. I've built an unfalsifiable worldview. So have you. If you've constructed your beliefs in a way that no evidence could ever challenge them, then you're not being scientific. You're being dogmatic. Her words stung because they were true. I'd mocked religious people for having unfalsifiable faith. But I'd done the same thing from the other direction. I'd built a worldview where anything that contradicted materialism could be explained away. That wasn't science. That was ideology. After she left, I lay there wrestling with uncomfortable questions. What if I'd been wrong? Not just about God, but about my entire approach to truth. What if I'd let my anger at my parents' rigid faith turn me rigid in the opposite direction? That evening, something unexpected happened. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize, but with an area code from my hometown. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Nathan," Is this Nathan Reeves? I knew the voice immediately, though I hadn't heard it in 20 years. Mom? Oh, thank God. Nathan, we just heard about your accident. Your colleague, Patricia Chen, she tracked us down through the university directory. She said you've been in the hospital for almost 2 weeks. Honey, why didn't you call us? We don't talk, Mom. We haven't talked in 20 years. I know, and that's been breaking our hearts. But Nathan, you're our son. No matter what's happened between us, no matter what you believe or don't believe, you're our son. We love you. Your father and I, we're getting on a plane tomorrow. We're coming to Los Angeles. Mom, you don't have to. Yes, we do. You're alone in a hospital. You're hurting. We're coming. After she hung up, I felt a tangle of emotions I couldn't sort through. Relief that I wouldn't be alone. Fear of facing people I'd rejected so completely. Guilt for the 20 years of silence. Anger that Patricia had contacted them without asking me. But underneath it all, something else. A small, desperate hope that maybe the isolation I'd built didn't have to be permanent. The next morning, I had a new visitor. A man about my age, dressed casually with an easy smile. Dr. Reeves, I'm Michael Torres. I'm a friend of Chaplain Margaret's. She mentioned you were here, and I wanted to stop by if that's okay. Are you another chaplain? No, I'm a philosophy professor at USC, but I used to be where you are. A militant atheist who thought faith was intellectual weakness, until something happened that I couldn't explain away. Despite myself, I was interested. What happened? He sat down. My daughter was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 7. Terminal, they said, maybe 6 months. And I was angry, furious at people who told me to pray, who said God had a plan, who offered religious platitudes while my little girl was dying. I was determined to face it rationally, to accept that this was just biology, cells malfunctioning, meaningless suffering, the random cruelty of an indifferent universe. No God to appeal to, no meaning to find, just the facts of cancer and mortality. But then something happened. In the hospital chapel, I'd gone there just to get away from people, not to pray. I had an experience I couldn't explain. I felt a presence, overwhelming love. And I heard, not audibly but clearly, she's mine, she's held. Whether she lives or dies, she's held. And did she live? I asked. She did. Full remission. The doctors called it inexplicable. But that's not the point. The point is, I'd already surrendered before I knew she'd survive. I'd already chosen to trust something beyond myself before I knew the outcome. And in that moment, I experienced a peace I couldn't explain with neuroscience or philosophy or atheist materialism. But you could explain it. Endorphins, stress response. The brain creating meaning in crisis. I've written about this. I know. I've read your papers. I assigned one of them in my philosophy of mind class. You're brilliant, Dr. Reeves. Your research is rigorous and important, but you're also limiting yourself. You've decided in advance that materialism is true, and you interpret every experience through that lens. What if you're wrong? What if there's something beyond the material that your instruments can't measure, but that's still real? Then show me evidence. Give me something I can test, measure, replicate. Not feelings or experiences or unfalsifiable claims. Real evidence. What if the evidence requires you to be open first? What if God doesn't respond to demands for proof, but to honest seeking? You've spent 20 years with your fists clenched, daring God to prove he exists. What if you tried opening your hands instead? After Michael left, his words kept circling in my mind. Had I been making demands while claiming to be neutral? Had my atheism become as dogmatic as the faith I'd rejected? That afternoon, I started reading. Not neuroscience papers, but something different. I asked the nurse if the hospital had a library, and she brought me a tablet with access to books. On impulse, I searched for C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I'd mocked Lewis in my university lectures, called him a clever writer but a poor philosopher, dismissed his arguments as emotional appeals rather than logical reasoning. But now, reading with different eyes, I found something I'd missed before. Lewis wasn't making scientific arguments. He was describing a journey from atheism to faith, from certainty to doubt, to a different kind of certainty, and his honesty about the struggle resonated in a way it never had before. If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, Lewis wrote, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. I'd always dismissed this as wishful thinking, but lying in that hospital bed, feeling the hunger for meaning that materialism couldn't satisfy, I wondered if Lewis was onto something. What if the hunger itself was evidence? What if we were designed for connection with something beyond ourselves, and the ache we felt was our soul recognizing its incompleteness? I was still thinking in terms of evidence and logic. I couldn't help it. It was how my brain worked. But I was beginning to ask different questions. Not, can I prove God exists? But what if I'm missing something real because I'm looking in the wrong places? That night, my parents arrived. I heard my mother's voice in the hallway before I saw her, talking to a nurse, asking directions to my room. Then she was there in the doorway, and 20 years vanished. "Nathan," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my boy." She rushed to my bedside, and I found myself crying too. 20 years of anger and hurt and separation, and all of it felt suddenly small compared to the simple fact. My mother was here. I wasn't alone anymore. My father hung back, uncertain. We'd never had an easy relationship. He was the one who'd been most rigid, most judgmental, most insistent that I was destroying my soul by rejecting faith. "Dad," I said. "Son." He stepped closer, awkward, not sure what to do with his hands. "We've been praying for you, for 20 years, every day, praying you were safe, that you were okay, that someday we'd have this chance again. I'm sorry," I said, "for cutting you off, for the silence, for being so angry that I couldn't see past it." "We're sorry too," my mother said, "for being so rigid, for making faith feel like a prison instead of freedom, for caring more about doctrine than about you. We got it wrong, Nathan. We got so much wrong." We talked for hours, about the 20 years between us, about my accident, about their lives, how they'd softened, learned, grown, how they'd come to understand that love had to come before dogma. That relationship mattered more than being right. "We don't expect you to believe what we believe," my father said. "We just want to be here, to support you, to be your parents again, if you'll let us." "I want that," I said. "I want that so much." After they left to check into a hotel, I lay in the darkness, processing everything. My parents were here. Michael Torres had shared his story. I'd read Lewis with new eyes. The crack in my certainty was widening. And that presence I'd felt 2 nights ago, it came again, stronger this time, undeniable, not just a feeling, but an encounter, a love so overwhelming it made me weep, a knowing so deep it bypassed all my intellectual defenses, a truth that didn't need to be proven because it was self-evident in the experiencing of it. This time, I didn't try to explain it away, didn't reach for neuroscience or materialism or any of my usual defenses. I just experienced it, received it, let it be what it was. And in that moment, I knew. Not intellectually, I didn't have answers to all my questions. Not theologically, I didn't understand doctrine or dogma. But experientially, undeniably, I knew. God was real. God was present. God was reaching out to me, had been reaching out all along, and I'd finally stopped running long enough to recognize it. "I don't understand this," I said out loud. "I don't know how to integrate this with everything I've believed. I don't have answers to all my questions. But you're here. You're real." I can't deny that anymore. The presence intensified, and I felt something I can only describe as delight, as if God was pleased. Not that I had all the answers, but that I'd finally admitted I didn't, that I'd finally opened my clenched fists and let go of my demand to understand everything before accepting anything. I cried for a long time that night, not from sadness, but from relief, from the overwhelming sense of being known, truly known, and loved anyway. From the realization that I didn't have to have it all figured out, that faith wasn't about intellectual certainty, but about trust, about relationship, about opening yourself to someone beyond yourself and letting that encounter transform you. I didn't have all the answers, didn't understand how this fit with neuroscience or materialism or any of my research. Didn't know what this meant for my career, my identity as an atheist, my life built on rejection of faith. But I knew this: God was real. I had encountered him, and nothing would ever be the same. The ex-atheist was being born, and the militant skeptic was beginning to die, and in his place something new was emerging, someone who'd been met by grace he didn't deserve and couldn't explain. Someone who was learning that the deepest truths couldn't be measured in a lab, but could be known in the heart. Someone who was, for the first time in 20 years, actually alive. The next morning, I woke up different. Not physically, the pain was still there, the injuries still healing, but internally, fundamentally, I was changed. The man who'd gone to sleep was not the same man who woke up. I'd encountered God, actually encountered him, and now I had to figure out what that meant. My parents arrived early, bringing coffee and pastries from a nearby bakery. My mother fussed over me like I was a child again, adjusting pillows, checking to make sure I was comfortable. My father stood awkwardly by the window, still uncertain how to bridge 20 years of distance. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something," I said. "Last night after you left, something happened." They both looked at me with sudden intensity. I felt God, experienced his presence. I know that sounds crazy coming from me, from someone who's spent 2 decades explaining why God doesn't exist, but it was real, undeniable, and I don't know what to do with that. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We've been praying for this moment for 20 years, praying you'd encounter God in a way you couldn't dismiss or explain away. I'm not saying I have it all figured out. I don't understand how this fits with my research, with neuroscience, with everything I've believed. I still have 1,000 questions, but I can't deny what I experienced. God is real. I know that now." My father finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Son, we failed you when you were growing up. We gave you religion instead of relationship, rules instead of grace. We made faith feel like a prison when it should have felt like freedom. And you rejected it because of how we presented it. That's on us. You don't have to figure everything out right now," my mother added. "You don't have to understand all the theology or have answers to all your questions. You just encountered the living God. Let that be enough for now. Let him lead you from there." After they left to get breakfast, Chaplain Margaret arrived for her daily visit. I told her what had happened, the experience, the presence, the undeniable knowing. "Welcome home," she said simply. "But I still don't understand. How do I integrate this with everything I know about neuroscience? How do I reconcile faith with science? How do I—" "Nathan, you're trying to figure out the entire journey before you've taken the first step. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to take the next right step. And right now, the next right step is simply acknowledging what you've experienced and being willing to follow where it leads." But my career, my reputation, I've built my entire professional identity on atheism, on materialism. I've published papers, given lectures, built a following. What happens to all of that? I don't know, but I know this: truth matters more than reputation. If you've encountered truth, if you've experienced something real that contradicts your previous beliefs, then you have to follow that truth wherever it leads, even if it costs you. Dr. Patricia Chen visited that afternoon. I told her about my experience, watching her face as I described what had happened. "I'm not surprised," she said. "When I was here the other day, I could see you were on the edge of something. The certainty was cracking. But Nathan, what are you going to do about it, about your work, your research, your position at the university? I don't know. I can't pretend this didn't happen. Can't go back to teaching that consciousness is just neurons firing when I've experienced something that suggests there's more. But I also can't throw away 20 years of research and career. Maybe you don't have to throw it away. Maybe you integrate it. Maybe you become a scientist who's also a person of faith. There's a history of that. Plenty of brilliant scientists who believe in God. Francis Collins, John Polkinghorne, Alistair McGrath. They didn't see faith and science as contradictory. But I've spent 20 years arguing they are contradictory. I've mocked religious scientists, called them intellectually inconsistent. How do I walk back from that? With humility, with honesty, with the willingness to say I was wrong. Nathan, the strongest position isn't defending your past beliefs. It's being open to truth, even when it contradicts what you used to think. After she left, I started researching on the hospital tablet, looking up scientists who were people of faith, reading their stories, their arguments for how science and belief could coexist. Francis Collins, director of the National Institutes of Health, former head of the Human Genome Project. A self-described serious Christian who saw no conflict between his faith and his science. He'd written, "I had always assumed that faith was based on purely emotional and irrational arguments, and was astounded to discover, initially in the writings of the Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis, and subsequently from many other sources, that one could build a very strong case for the plausibility of the existence of God on purely rational grounds." John Polkinghorne, quantum physicist and Anglican priest. He argued that science and theology were friends, not foes, and that both sought truth through different but complementary methods. Alistair McGrath, molecular biophysicist turned theologian. A former atheist who'd come to faith and then spent his career showing how Christian theology and natural science could enrich each other. These weren't uneducated people. They weren't abandoning reason for faith. They were integrating both, seeing them as different ways of knowing truth about different aspects of reality. Maybe I could do the same. Maybe my neuroscience research could continue, but informed by the recognition that consciousness was more than just brain activity, that the material world science studied was real, but not the only reality. That empirical investigation and spiritual experience could both be valid ways of encountering truth. That evening, Michael Torres returned. I told him about my decision to be honest about my experience, to stop pretending it didn't happen. "That's brave," he said, "but be prepared. There will be backlash. The atheist community doesn't take kindly to defectors, especially prominent ones. They'll say you had a breakdown, that the trauma made you vulnerable to religious thinking, that you've abandoned reason. I know. I've said those things about others who converted, called them weak, intellectually compromised, victims of emotional manipulation. So you know what's coming. The question is, are you willing to face it? To be honest, even when it costs you professionally and socially? I have to be, because I can't pretend this didn't happen. Can't go back to teaching that God doesn't exist when I've experienced him. That would be the real intellectual dishonesty, knowing something is true, but denying it because it's inconvenient. Then let me give you some advice from someone who's been through this. Don't try to prove your experience to others. You can't. They didn't experience it, and no argument will convince them it was real. Just be honest about what happened to you. Tell your story. Let others draw their own conclusions. But I'm a scientist. I want evidence. I want to be able to demonstrate, and that's the trap. You want to stay in your intellectual comfort zone, where everything can be proven and demonstrated. But faith doesn't work that way. It's experiential, relational. You can't prove God exists the way you'd prove a scientific hypothesis. You can only encounter him and then decide whether that encounter was real. After Michael left, I spent the evening writing. Not a scientific paper, but something different. My story. What had happened to me. The journey from militant atheism to... what? I wasn't sure what to call myself yet. Believer? Christian? I didn't know enough about theology or doctrine to claim any label confidently, but I knew this. I'd been an atheist who encountered God, and I couldn't pretend that hadn't happened. I wrote about the accident, about lying in the hospital confronting the inadequacy of my materialist worldview, about the desperate prayer, about the presence I'd felt, about my parents showing up, about the overwhelming love I'd experienced that had shattered all my defenses. When I finished, I had 10 pages, raw, honest, vulnerable. Nothing like my usual academic writing. No citations, no formal structure, just truth. I sent it to Patricia. Tell me if I'm crazy. Tell me if this makes sense or if I'm just having some kind of breakdown. She called me an hour later. Nathan, this is beautiful. And no, you're not crazy. You had an experience. You're being honest about it. That's not a breakdown. That's courage. Should I publish it, make it public? That's up to you, but if you do, be prepared for the response. It won't all be positive. The next day, my parents brought me something unexpected, a Bible. Not the stern, judgmental version I remembered from childhood, but a modern translation with study notes. We thought you might want to read, my mother said. Not to cram religion down your throat, but to discover who this God is that you've encountered. To learn about him from his own revelation rather than from our flawed representation. I took it hesitantly. The last time I'd read the Bible was to find contradictions and ammunition for debates. But now, reading with different eyes, I found something else. I started with the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The philosophical precision of it surprised me. John was making ontological claims about the nature of reality, about the relationship between the transcendent and the material. Then Jesus' words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Not, I teach the way, or I point to the truth, but I am. Identity claims, claims to be truth embodied, not just truth described. And this, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Freedom through truth, not freedom from truth, but through it. As if truth wasn't a constraint, but a liberation. I'd always thought Christianity was anti-intellectual, hostile to questions, demanding blind faith. But reading Jesus' interactions with doubters and skeptics, I saw something different. He welcomed questions, engaged with doubt, invited people to come and see rather than demanding they believe without evidence. Thomas doubting the resurrection, saying, unless I see, I will not believe. And Jesus showing up specifically for Thomas, inviting him to touch the wounds, providing the evidence he needed, not condemning the doubt, but meeting it. Maybe faith wasn't the opposite of reason. Maybe it was reason informed by revelation, evidence that came through experience rather than just through empirical observation. That evening, Dr. Martinez, my therapist before the accident, came to visit. We'd scheduled sessions to work on my control issues, my workaholism. I hadn't seen her since before the crash. Nathan, I heard about the accident. How are you doing, both physically and mentally? I told her everything. The injuries, the recovery process, and then the spiritual experience. I know this sounds crazy coming from me, the militant atheist having a religious experience, but it was real, Dr. Martinez, and I don't know how to process it. It doesn't sound crazy. You experienced trauma, confronted mortality, and had your worldview challenged. That's fertile ground for transformation. The question isn't whether your experience was real in some objective sense. The question is what you're going to do with it. I want to be honest about it, but I'm scared of what that means for my career, my reputation, my identity. Of course you are. You're dismantling a 20-year structure you built your entire life around. That's terrifying. But Nathan, I've worked with you for 2 years, and I've watched you be deeply unhappy while being professionally successful. You were brilliant and accomplished and miserable. Maybe this experience, whatever it was, is an invitation to something more than just success, to something like meaning, purpose, connection. But what if I'm wrong? What if this was just my brain creating comfort in crisis? What if 6 months from now, when I'm healed and back to normal life, this all feels like temporary insanity? Then you'll deal with that when it comes. But right now, in this moment, you had an experience that felt real and transformative. Honor that. Don't dismiss it prematurely because you're afraid it might not last. After she left, I sat with her words. Maybe I was overthinking this. Maybe I didn't need to have all the answers before I acknowledged what had happened. Maybe I could just say, I experienced something that changed me. I'm following where it leads. I'll figure out the details as I go. That night, I prayed. Not desperately like before, but conversationally, like talking to someone who was present and listening. God, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to be a person of faith when I've spent 20 years being militantly against faith. I don't know how to integrate this experience with my science, my work, my identity, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to follow. I'm willing to be changed. Show me what comes next. Show me how to walk this path. Show me how to be honest without being reckless. How to have faith without abandoning reason. How to believe in you while still being intellectually rigorous. I don't have it figured out, but I'm here. I'm listening. I'm open. Lead me. And in the silence that followed, I felt that presence again. Not as overwhelming as before, but steady, constant, like a hand reaching out, inviting me to take the next step without needing to see the whole staircase. I didn't have all the answers, didn't understand how this would all work out, didn't know what my life would look like on the other side of this transformation, but I knew this. I'd encountered truth, real, undeniable truth, and I had to follow it, even if I didn't know where it led. The ex-atheist was still being born, still figuring out what faith looked like, still learning to integrate belief with reason, experience with intellect, heart with mind. But he was walking forward, taking the next step, choosing truth over comfort, honesty over reputation, transformation over stagnation. And that was enough. For now, that was enough. 3 weeks into my hospital stay, I was transferred to a rehabilitation facility. The acute injuries had healed enough that I no longer needed intensive care, but I wasn't ready to go home. I needed weeks of physical therapy to rebuild strength, to learn to walk properly again, to regain the function the accident had stolen. The rehab facility was quieter than the hospital. Fewer machines, fewer emergencies, just the steady work of healing. And in that quietness, I had time to think, to read, to pray, to figure out what my life would look like on the other side of this transformation. My parents visited daily. We were rebuilding slowly, carefully. 20 years of distance couldn't be bridged in a few weeks. But we were trying, and in the trying, I was learning things about them I'd never known. My father told me about his own crisis of faith 10 years ago, how he'd questioned everything he believed, how he'd almost walked away from church, from God, from the rigid system he'd grown up with. But instead of leaving, he'd found a different kind of faith, one based on relationship rather than rules, grace rather than performance, love rather than judgment. "I wish I'd figured that out before you left," he said. "Maybe if we'd shown you that version of faith, the real one, not the harsh, legalistic version we inherited from our own parents, maybe you wouldn't have rejected it so completely. Maybe. Or maybe I needed to reject it completely so I could encounter God on my own terms. Not your faith inherited, but my own faith discovered. My mother brought me books, not apologetics or theology. She was wise enough to know I'd resist anything that felt like indoctrination. Instead, she brought stories, memoirs of people who journeyed from atheism to faith. Lee Strobel, C.S. Lewis, Francis Collins, each story different, but all sharing that moment of encounter, that experience of meeting someone that couldn't be explained away. I read voraciously, and I started writing more. Not academic papers, but reflections, processing my experience, working through my questions, trying to articulate what was happening to me. One afternoon, I received an email that made my stomach clench. From Dr. Richard Morrison, head of the neuroscience department at UCLA. "Nathan, I heard about your accident. We've been worried about you. Patricia Chen mentioned you're recovering well physically, but she also mentioned something concerning, that you've been having spiritual experiences in the hospital. I want to meet with you when you're able, to discuss how you're processing the trauma. Sometimes severe accidents can trigger psychological effects that seem spiritual but are actually neurological. I want to make sure you're getting proper care." I read it 3 times, feeling anger and shame in equal measure. He thought I was having a breakdown. Thought my encounter with God was brain damage or trauma response. Thought I needed psychiatric intervention rather than spiritual guidance. But then again, Hadn't I thought the same thing about others? Hadn't I explained away religious experiences as temporal lobe activity, as stress responses, as the brain's tendency to create meaning where there was none? I couldn't be angry at him for thinking what I would have thought 2 months ago. I replied carefully, "Dr. Morrison, thank you for your concern. You're right that I've had experiences that have challenged my previous worldview. I'm processing them carefully and thoughtfully. When I'm ready to return to campus, I'd be happy to meet with you to discuss my research moving forward. But I want you to know I haven't had a breakdown. I've had a breakthrough. And yes, that sounds exactly like what someone having a breakdown would say. I'm aware of the irony." His response came within an hour. "I'm glad you're self-aware about how this might appear. I'll reserve judgment until we can talk in person. Take care of yourself, Nathan. The department needs you back. The department needs you back. Not we miss you or we care about you. Just the reminder that I was valuable for my productivity, for what I could contribute to their research output and publication record. I thought about my life before the accident, 70-hour weeks in the lab, publications and grants and accolades, success by every academic metric, but emotionally empty, relationally isolated, spiritually dead, though I wouldn't have used that word at the time. Did I want to go back to that? Could I go back to that, now that I'd experienced something deeper? That evening, Chaplain Margaret visited. I told her about Dr. Morrison's email, about his concern that I was having a trauma response rather than a spiritual experience. "What do you think?" she asked. "Is he right? Scientifically, he could be. Every religious experience I've had could theoretically be explained neurologically. Endorphins, temporal lobe activity, the brain creating meaning in crisis. I know the research. I've done some of it myself. But explanations aren't the same as explanations away. Yes, there are neural correlates to spiritual experiences, but maybe those neural mechanisms exist because there's something real to experience. Maybe God designed our brains to be capable of encountering him. So you're not choosing between science and faith, you're integrating them. Trying to, but it's hard. My entire career has been built on materialist assumptions, and now I'm claiming to have experienced something beyond the material. That's going to be seen as intellectual inconsistency, as abandoning reason for emotion. Or it could be seen as following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it contradicts your previous beliefs. That's what good scientists do, isn't it?" She was right. The scientific method was supposed to be about following evidence, not defending predetermined conclusions. And I had evidence, experiential evidence, that something beyond the material was real. To ignore that evidence because it contradicted my worldview would be the real intellectual dishonesty. The next day brought another visitor I didn't expect, Professor David Ashford, a philosopher from UC Berkeley who I'd debated publicly several times. He was a Christian philosopher who argued for the compatibility of faith and reason, and I'd spent several years mocking his arguments as sophisticated nonsense. "Nathan," he said, sitting beside my bed, "I heard about your accident and about your experience. I wanted to check on you. You came all the way from Berkeley to gloat, to say I told you so?" He smiled. "No, I came because I remember what it was like, making this transition. I was an atheist too, once, not as militant as you, but committed to materialism. And when I encountered God, I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was betraying everything I'd built my intellectual identity on. What did you do?" "I followed the truth, even though it cost me. I lost atheist friends who thought I'd had a breakdown. I lost academic credibility with colleagues who saw my conversion as intellectual weakness. But I gained something infinitely more valuable. I gained truth, real truth, not just the limited truth that materialism could offer. But how do you integrate it? How do you do philosophy, do academic work, while believing in something that can't be empirically verified? The same way everyone does. You recognize that empirical verification isn't the only way to know truth. You can't empirically verify mathematical truths, but they're real. You can't empirically verify ethical truths, but we act as if they're real. You can't empirically verify the reality of consciousness itself. The hard problem remains unsolved. So why should spiritual truths be held to a different standard? Because they make claims about a supernatural reality, about God, about miracles, about the foundation of reality itself. Yes, but Nathan, you've experienced it. You know it's real, not because someone argued you into it, but because you encountered it directly. That's not less valid than empirical observation. It's just a different kind of observation. First-person experience of the transcendent. We talked for 2 hours about philosophy, about neuroscience, about the relationship between mind and matter, and slowly I began to see how faith and reason could work together rather than against each other. How believing in God didn't mean abandoning intellectual rigor. It meant applying that rigor to a fuller picture of reality. "Let me give you some advice," David said before he left. "Write about this. Document your journey, not to convince others. You can't convince anyone of something they haven't experienced, but to show them that the journey is possible, that brilliant, thoughtful people can encounter God and not abandon their intellect, that faith and reason aren't enemies. I've started writing, but I don't know if I should make it public." You should, because there are others like you, intellectuals who've encountered something beyond materialism, but are afraid to admit it because of what it might cost them professionally. Your story could give them permission to be honest. After he left, I continued reading through the books my mother had brought. One in particular struck me, The Reason for God by Tim Keller. Keller was addressing the objections I'd spent years raising: suffering, religious hypocrisy, scientific inconsistency. But instead of dismissing them, he engaged with them thoughtfully, showing how Christian faith actually made better sense of reality than materialism did. One passage stopped me. If we were made to know God and to live in relationship with Him, then our intellectual and existential hunger for meaning makes perfect sense. But if we're just the product of random chance, why would we have this hunger at all? Why would we consistently feel that there must be more than just material existence? It was the argument from desire that C.S. Lewis had made. And reading it now, having experienced the fulfillment of that hunger, I understood it differently. The hunger wasn't evidence that God didn't exist. It was evidence that we were made for something beyond ourselves, made for relationship with the divine. That night during physical therapy, I met another patient, James, a man in his 40s recovering from a stroke. We were both learning to walk again. Me from the accident, him from the stroke's neurological damage. "What do you do?" he asked during a break between exercises. "I'm a neuroscience researcher, or I was. I'm not sure what I am anymore." "Why not sure?" So I told him. About the accident, about the encounter with God, about how it was changing everything I thought I knew about consciousness and reality. "And you studied brains? Consciousness? That's wild, man. So you're saying consciousness is more than just brain activity?" "I'm saying I experienced something that suggests there's a spiritual dimension to consciousness that we can't measure with instruments, but that's still real. I don't have it all worked out, but I can't deny what I experienced." "I get that. When I had the stroke, when I was on the edge of dying, I saw something or experienced something. I can't explain it, but it was like I was held. Like even if I died, I'd be okay because I was held by something bigger than myself." "Did you tell your doctors?" "No. They'd think it was the stroke, hallucination or something. But it was real, you know. More real than regular reality." We talked until the physical therapist called us back to continue our exercises. And I realized this was part of what faith meant. Not just individual experience, but shared experience. Community of people who'd encountered something beyond themselves and recognized it in each other's stories. Later that week, I had my first video call with my former research team at UCLA. They wanted to update me on ongoing projects to get my input on papers in progress. But the conversation felt strange. They were talking about consciousness as purely material phenomenon, about the self as illusion, about meaning as human invention, and all of it felt hollow now. Not wrong exactly. The research was rigorous, the data solid, but incomplete, missing the dimension I'd discovered. "Nathan, you seem distracted," Dr. Morrison said. "Are you following?" "Yes, sorry, just still recovering. Pain medication makes focus difficult." But it wasn't the medication. It was that I couldn't engage with the work the same way anymore. Couldn't pretend consciousness was just neurons when I'd experienced something that transcended the neural. Couldn't teach that meaning was illusory when I'd encountered the source of meaning itself. After the call, I sat with the question I'd been avoiding. Could I return to my old work? Could I go back to the lab, back to teaching, back to research that assumed God didn't exist? Maybe not. Maybe I needed to find new work, new direction, a way to integrate what I'd discovered with what I'd spent 20 years learning. I called David Ashford. "You said I should write about this journey. What if I did more than that? What if I tried to develop a neuroscience of spiritual experience, not explaining it away, but actually studying how the brain engages with the transcendent? That would be revolutionary and controversial. You'd face enormous pushback from the materialist establishment. I know. But isn't that what intellectual courage requires? Following truth, even when it's unpopular, even when it costs you? Yes, yes it is. And Nathan, I think you're called to this. To be a bridge between the scientific and spiritual communities. To show them they're not enemies but partners in understanding the fullness of reality. That night, I prayed more specifically than I had before. God, I don't know if I'm supposed to go back to UCLA. I don't know if I can do my old work with this new understanding. But if you're calling me to something different, to researching the intersection of neuroscience and spirituality, to being honest about what I've experienced even when it's professionally costly, then give me courage, give me wisdom, give me direction. I'm scared. Scared of losing my career, my reputation, my identity as a scientist. But I'm more scared of denying what I know to be true just to keep those things. So lead me. Show me the way forward. The presence I'd learned to recognize settled over me, not giving answers, but giving assurance, not revealing the whole path, but illuminating the next step. And the next step was clear. Finish my recovery, yes, but also finish the writing I'd started. Turn my journey into something others could read. Document the transformation from militant atheist to humble believer. Show that the journey was possible without abandoning intellectual integrity. I opened my laptop and started writing in earnest. Not just reflections anymore, but a structured narrative. From lab to faith, a neuroscientist's journey from atheism to belief. Working title, but it captured what I was trying to do. I wrote about my background, my angry rejection of my parents' faith, my 20 years building a career on materialism, the accident, the desperation, the encounter, the transformation still in progress. And I wrote honestly about the struggles, the intellectual challenges of integrating faith with science, the fear of professional consequences, the ongoing questions I didn't have answers to, the tension between what I'd experienced and what I'd been trained to believe. This wasn't a polished apologetic argument. It was a messy, honest testimony, a scientist admitting he'd encountered something beyond his instruments, a materialist confessing that materialism wasn't adequate, an atheist acknowledging that God was real. It was risky, vulnerable, potentially career-ending, but it was true. And I'd spent my whole life saying truth mattered more than comfort. Now I had to prove I meant it. The ex-atheist was taking shape, finding his voice, preparing to go public with a story that would shock his colleagues, confuse his former allies, and hopefully help others who were traveling the same journey. I didn't have all the answers, didn't understand everything about this new faith, didn't know exactly what my future looked like. But I knew this. God was real. I'd encountered him, and I couldn't pretend I hadn't. Whatever came next, I'd face it honestly, with faith and with reason, with humility and with courage. The journey from lab to faith was just beginning, and I was ready to walk it. 6 weeks after the accident, I was discharged from the rehab facility. I could walk with a cane now, could manage daily activities, could function independently even if I wasn't back to full strength. My parents helped me move back into my apartment, which felt both familiar and foreign after nearly 2 months away. The first night home, I sat in my living room looking at my bookshelves, lined with neuroscience textbooks, atheist philosophy, materialist treatises, the library of my old life, evidence of who I'd been before the accident. I pulled down one of my own books, Consciousness Without God, a neuroscientist's argument for materialism. I'd been so proud when it was published 5 years ago, so certain of my arguments, so confident in my conclusions. Now, reading passages I'd written, I could see the holes, the assumptions I'd made, the questions I'd dismissed rather than engaged with, the arrogance of claiming to have solved mysteries that philosophers and scientists had wrestled with for millennia. I was so sure, I said to my mother, who was making tea in my kitchen, so absolutely certain that I had it figured out. And we're all sure when we're young, she said, bringing me a cup. It's only with experience that we learn how little we actually know. But I wasn't young. I was 35 when I wrote that book, an established researcher, and I was still making rookie mistakes, assuming materialism rather than arguing for it, dismissing contrary evidence, building an unfalsifiable worldview. So what will you do now? Retract it? Disavow it? I don't know. Part of me wants to burn every copy. Part of me thinks it has value as documentation of where I was, even if I'm somewhere different now. Maybe both things can be true. It was the best thinking I could do at that time, even though I know better now. That week, I had my first meeting with Dr. Morrison at UCLA. I took the bus to campus, couldn't drive yet with my injuries, and walked slowly to the neuroscience building. Students passed me, oblivious, going about their normal lives while mine had been completely upended. Dr. Morrison's office looked exactly as I remembered. Papers stacked everywhere, diagrams of neural pathways on the walls, the faint smell of coffee perpetually brewing. "Nathan," he said, standing to shake my hand, "you look well. Better than I expected." "Thanks. Physical therapy is helping. I'm not back to normal, but I'm getting there." "Good, good. Sit down. I want to hear about what's been happening with you." "Patricia said you've been having spiritual experiences, that you're questioning materialism." I took a breath. This was it. The moment of truth with my department head, my mentor, the man who'd championed my career. I encountered God in the hospital. I know how that sounds coming from me. I know you're thinking it's trauma or medication, or some neurological effect of my injuries. And maybe you're right. Maybe there are neural correlates to what I experienced. But Dr. Morrison, it was real. More real than this conversation we're having now. And I can't pretend it wasn't. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me. "Nathan, I'm going to be direct with you. What you're describing concerns me. Not because I think you're lying, but because I think you're experiencing something that needs medical attention, not spiritual interpretation. I'm not having delusions. I'm not hearing voices or having hallucinations. I had an experience of presence, of being known and loved by something beyond myself. That's not pathology, that's encounter. But you're a neuroscientist. You know how the brain creates these experiences. Temporal lobe activity, endorphin release, the brain's tendency to create agency where there is none. We've published papers on this together." "I know. And yes, there are neural mechanisms involved in spiritual experience. But what if those mechanisms exist because there's something real to experience? What if God designed our brains to be capable of encountering Him?" Dr. Morrison shook his head. "You're engaging in motivated reasoning, starting with a conclusion that God exists, and working backward to make the evidence fit. That's not science, Nathan. Neither is starting with the conclusion that God doesn't exist and dismissing any evidence to the contrary. That's what we've been doing. That's what I've been doing for 20 years. And it's not neutral, it's ideological. So what are you saying? You want to abandon your research? Turn your back on everything you've built? No, I want to expand it. I want to study the neuroscience of spiritual experience without the materialist assumption that it's all illusion. I want to investigate whether consciousness really is reducible to neural activity or whether there's something more. That's not science. That's apologetics disguised as research. Why? Because it's open to conclusions you disagree with. Science is supposed to follow evidence wherever it leads, not protect predetermined conclusions. And my experience is evidence. Subjective? Yes. Not replicable in a lab? Yes. But still real. Still data that needs to be accounted for. We argued for another hour. He insisted I was having a breakdown masked as breakthrough. I maintained I was following evidence he refused to consider. Neither of us convinced the other. Finally, he said, I can't stop you from pursuing this direction, but I want you to know, if you continue down this path, publishing work that argues for consciousness beyond brain activity, for spiritual reality, for God, you'll be committing professional suicide. The materialist establishment won't forgive it. You'll lose credibility, lose funding, lose your position here. I know, but I can't deny what I know to be true just to protect my career. That would be the real intellectual dishonesty. When I left his office, I felt shaken but certain. The cost was going to be higher than I'd imagined, but the alternative, pretending my encounter hadn't happened, teaching materialism I no longer believed, was impossible. That evening I called David Ashford. I met with my department head. It didn't go well. He thinks I'm having a breakdown. He warned me that pursuing this direction will end my career. He's probably right about the career part. The Academy doesn't take kindly to people who abandon materialism, especially prominent ones. You'll be labeled as someone who couldn't handle success, who cracked under pressure, who abandoned reason for emotion. They'll find ways to dismiss you. So what do? You decide what matters more, your career or your integrity, your reputation or the truth, your colleagues' approval or God's calling. Because, Nathan, you can't have both. Not in the current academic climate. You're going to have to choose. What did you choose? Truth. And it cost me. I lost positions, lost funding, lost friends. But I gained something more valuable. I gained authenticity. I stopped living a lie. I started doing work that actually mattered instead of just work that impressed my peers. But you're still in academia. You're still a philosopher. At a Christian university, yes. I found a place where I could integrate faith and reason without having to pretend one didn't exist. Maybe that's what you need to do. Find an institution where your new perspective is an asset rather than a liability. After we hung up, I sat with that possibility. Leave UCLA? Leave the prestigious position I'd worked 20 years to achieve? It felt like admitting defeat, like the atheist establishment would win. They'd driven out the defector, protected their ideological purity. But maybe it wasn't defeat. Maybe it was liberation. Freedom to pursue truth without having to conform to materialist orthodoxy. Space to explore the intersection of neuroscience and spirituality without constant opposition. The next day, I received an email that surprised me, from Dr. Sarah Chen, a former colleague who'd left UCLA 3 years ago to teach at Biola University, a Christian institution. Nathan, I heard through the grapevine about your accident and about your spiritual experience. I wanted to reach out. I went through something similar 8 years ago, an encounter with God that changed everything. I tried to stay at UCLA, tried to continue my research while being honest about my faith, but the hostility was too much. So I moved to Biola. And Nathan, it's been the best decision of my career. I'm doing better work than I ever did at UCLA because I don't have to hide half of reality to please the materialist gatekeepers. If you want to talk about options, about what it might look like to continue your research in an environment that welcomes faith rather than opposes it, let me know. I called her immediately. We talked for 2 hours about her journey, her work at Biola, the research she was doing on consciousness and spirituality. She was thriving, publishing, teaching, mentoring students. And she was doing it while being openly Christian, while integrating faith and science. The Academy needs people like you, she said. Scientists who are brilliant and rigorous, and also people of faith, who can show that the two aren't incompatible. But you probably can't do that at a secular institution right now. The hostility is too strong. Maybe someday that will change, but for now you might need to find a place where you're welcomed rather than merely tolerated. After the call, I pulled out the manuscript I'd been writing. From Lab to Faith had grown to over 100 pages. My story, my struggles, my attempts to integrate what I'd learned. I sent it to 3 people, David Ashford, Sarah Chen, and my mother. Asked them to read it and give me honest feedback. Tell me if I was being clear or confusing, rigorous or emotional, helpful or self-indulgent. Their responses came back within a week. All 3 said the same thing. Publish it. Make it public. Let people know this journey is possible. You're writing for people like you were, David said. Intellectuals who've encountered something beyond materialism but are afraid to admit it. Scientists who've had spiritual experiences but dismiss them because they don't fit the paradigm. Your story could give them permission to be honest. I spent the next 2 weeks revising, editing, tightening the argument. And then I did something terrifying. I published it online, put it on Medium, shared it on social media, sent the link to colleagues and friends. A neuroscientist's journey from atheism to faith. How a hospital encounter changed everything I believed. The response was immediate and polarizing. Former atheist allies attacked me viciously, called me a fraud, said I'd had a breakdown, accused me of betraying the movement. The comments were brutal. Another scientist who couldn't handle the implications of materialism and ran to the comfort of superstition. Tragic to see a brilliant mind destroyed by trauma and wishful thinking. This is what happens when you let emotion override reason. But others responded differently. People I didn't know, reaching out privately to say thank you. Scientists who'd had similar experiences but had been afraid to admit it. Academics who'd been hiding their faith because the climate was so hostile. Students who'd been told they couldn't be both intellectually rigorous and spiritually open. I'm a physics professor at MIT, one email read. I've been a Christian for 10 years, but I've hidden it from my colleagues because I knew they'd see it as intellectual weakness. Reading your story gave me courage to be more open. Thank you. Another. I'm a graduate student in biology. I had a spiritual experience 2 years ago that I've been trying to dismiss ever since because I didn't think it was compatible with science. Your article showed me I don't have to choose. I can integrate both. Thank you for being brave enough to go public. The messages kept coming. Dozens, then hundreds. People hungry for permission to be honest about experiences their worldview couldn't accommodate. But so did the professional consequences. Dr. Morrison called. Nathan, I saw your article. We need to talk about your future at UCLA. The department is concerned about your ability to conduct objective research given your new beliefs. We're going to have to discuss whether this is still the right fit. Translation, they wanted me gone. The ex-atheist was an embarrassment, a liability, evidence that maybe their materialist consensus wasn't as solid as they claimed. I felt surprisingly calm. I understand. Let me make it easy for you. I'll resign. Not because I'm ashamed of what I wrote, but because I need to be somewhere I can do honest work without pretending half of reality doesn't exist. Nathan, think about what you're giving up. Your position here, your lab, your funding, your reputation. I'm not giving it up. I'm trading it for something better, for intellectual integrity, for the freedom to follow truth wherever it leads, for work that actually means something instead of just impressing my peers. After I hung up, I called Sarah Chen. I'm out at UCLA, officially. I resigned rather than be pushed out. Do you think Biola would be interested in someone with my background? Are you kidding? You'd be perfect. A neuroscientist who can speak to both the scientific and spiritual communities, who can help students integrate faith and reason. Nathan, they'd be honored to have you. Within 2 weeks, I had an offer. Assistant Professor of Neuroscience and Philosophy at Biola University. Lower pay than UCLA, less prestigious, but the freedom to do real work, to explore consciousness without materialist constraints, to teach students that science and faith could work together rather than against each other. I accepted. My atheist friends were horrified. "You're throwing away your career for superstition," one former colleague wrote. "You had so much potential. Now you'll be stuck at some religious backwater, teaching pseudoscience to Christian kids. What a waste." But I didn't feel like it was a waste. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was doing work that mattered. Not just publishing to impress peers, but actually seeking truth. Not just explaining consciousness materialistically, but exploring its full depth, physical, mental, and spiritual. The night before I started at Biola, I sat in my apartment surrounded by boxes, starting over at 38. New job, new institution, new identity. The militant atheist was dead. The ex-atheist was taking his place, and I was okay with that. More than okay. I was alive in a way I'd never been before, connected to truth in a way that went deeper than data, open to reality in a way that included but transcended the material. I prayed that night with gratitude. Thank you for the accident. I never thought I'd say that, but thank you, because without it, I'd still be living a lie, still be pretending I had it all figured out, still be closed to the very thing I was made for, relationship with you. I don't know what comes next. Don't know if I'll be successful at Biola. Don't know if my research will amount to anything. Don't know if this path I'm choosing will lead anywhere significant, but I know this: I'm following truth, I'm living with integrity, I'm being honest about what I've experienced even when it costs me. And that's enough, that's more than enough. Use me however you want. Lead me wherever you're leading. I'm yours. The presence I'd learned to recognize settled over me once more, not with answers, but with assurance. Not revealing the future, but confirming the path. And in that presence, I found peace. The ex-atheist was ready for his new beginning, and whatever came next, he'd face it with faith and reason working together rather than at war. That was the real miracle. Not that God had spoken to me in the hospital, though he had, but that he'd given me the courage to follow where that speaking led, even when it cost me everything I'd built. The journey from lab to faith was complete in one sense. I'd made the crossing. I'd left atheism behind. But in another sense, it was just beginning. Now came the work of living out this new understanding, of doing science informed by faith, of helping others make the same journey, of being a bridge between two communities that thought they were enemies. That was my calling now. And I was ready to embrace it, whatever the cost. My first semester at Biola University was unlike anything I'd experienced at UCLA. Walking across campus, I'd see students praying together between classes. Faculty meetings opened with prayer. Chapel was a regular part of campus life. It felt foreign and familiar at the same time. Foreign because I'd spent 20 years in secular academia. Familiar because it reminded me of the childhood faith I'd rejected. But this was different from my childhood experience. This wasn't rigid fundamentalism. It was thoughtful engagement with both scripture and science. Faculty here weren't afraid of hard questions or intellectual rigor. They welcomed both. My first class was Neuroscience and the Soul, a course I'd designed to explore the intersection of brain science and spiritual reality. 23 students enrolled, a mix of neuroscience majors and philosophy majors, all curious about how to integrate faith and science. On the first day, I stood before them and said something I never would have said at UCLA. I'm going to tell you my story, about being a militant atheist, about encountering God in a hospital, about how that encounter changed everything I thought I knew about consciousness and reality. And then we're going to spend this semester exploring these questions together, not with predetermined answers, but with genuine inquiry. I told them about my research at UCLA, about my book, Arguing for Consciousness Without God, about the accident, about the presence I'd felt that couldn't be explained away, about the journey from certainty to doubt to a different kind of certainty. When I finished, a student raised her hand. "Dr. Reeves, how do you reconcile your scientific training with belief in something that can't be empirically verified?" That's the question, isn't it? Here's what I've learned. Empirical verification isn't the only way to know truth. We can't empirically verify that other minds are conscious. That's the hard problem of consciousness. We can't empirically verify mathematical truths. They're known through reason. We can't empirically verify ethical truths, yet we act as if they're real. So why should spiritual truths be held to a different standard than these other non-empirical truths? But those are abstract. God is supposed to be personal, someone who acts in the world. Shouldn't that be empirically detectable? Maybe it is. Maybe spiritual experiences are empirical data, first-person experiential data rather than third-person observational data. We privilege third-person data in science because it's easier to verify. But that doesn't mean first-person experiential data isn't real or isn't valuable. It's just a different kind of evidence. The semester unfolded with conversations like that. Deep questions, honest struggles, students wrestling with how to integrate what they believed with what they were learning. And I was learning alongside them. I was also writing. The article I'd published had generated enough interest that a Christian publisher reached out about turning it into a book. The Ex-Atheist, a neuroscientist's journey from materialism to faith. Writing it was cathartic and challenging. I had to articulate not just what had happened to me, but why it mattered, how my experience related to broader questions about consciousness, meaning, and reality, how faith and science could work together rather than in opposition. One chapter focused on the neuroscience of religious experience. I reviewed the research, the studies showing temporal lobe involvement in mystical experiences, the endorphin release during prayer, the neural correlates of spiritual states. But then I argued that these neural mechanisms didn't explain away spiritual experience any more than understanding the neuroscience of vision explains away the existence of the external world. The brain has mechanisms for experiencing reality. That doesn't mean reality isn't real. Another chapter addressed the problem of suffering. How could I believe in a loving God after experiencing the trauma and pain of the accident? My answer: suffering wasn't evidence against God's existence, but it was evidence that reality was more complex than simple materialism suggested. Materialism said suffering was meaningless. Faith said suffering could have meaning even when we couldn't see it. And my experience suggested the faith perspective better matched reality, that even in the midst of pain, I'd encountered a love that held me. The most difficult chapter was about intellectual humility, admitting how arrogant I'd been, how certain, how dismissive of views that contradicted my own, how I'd built an unfalsifiable worldview and then mocked others for having unfalsifiable faith. I was guilty of the very thing I accused religious people of, I wrote. I decided in advance what was true and then interpreted all evidence through that lens. That's not science, that's ideology. Real intellectual humility requires being open to evidence that contradicts your worldview, even when that evidence is experiential rather than empirical. 3 months into the semester, I was invited to give a lecture at a church in Los Angeles. A large evangelical congregation interested in how science and faith related. I was nervous. Churches were still foreign territory to me. I knew the Bible now, had been studying it intensely. But church culture, worship styles, Christian vocabulary, all of it still felt unfamiliar. The pastor who introduced me was gracious. Dr. Reeves is going to share his story tonight, a story of intellectual honesty, of following evidence wherever it leads, of encountering truth that changed everything. Let's welcome him. I stood before 500 people and told my story again. About UCLA, about militant atheism, about the accident, about the hospital encounter, about how everything I'd believed had been challenged and ultimately transformed. When I finished, the pastor opened it up for questions. How do you respond to skeptics who say you had a breakdown, not a breakthrough? I understand why they think that. I would have thought the same thing 2 years ago. All I can say is, I know what I experienced. It was real. More real than anything I'd experienced before. And the fruit of that experience, the way it's transformed my life, given me peace, connected me to truth, that's evidence it was genuine, not pathology. Do you still consider yourself a scientist? Absolutely. I'm doing neuroscience research right now, publishing papers, teaching courses. But I'm doing science with a different set of assumptions, that material reality isn't all there is, that consciousness might be more than just brain activity, that spiritual experience is real data that needs to be accounted for. That's still science. It's just science with a fuller picture of reality. What would you say to young people who are being told they have to choose between faith and science? I'd say that's a false choice. Some of the greatest scientists in history were people of faith. Isaac Newton, Gregor Mendel, Francis Collins. Faith and science ask different questions and use different methods, but they're both seeking truth. You don't have to choose. You can integrate both. You can do rigorous science while believing in God. They're not enemies, they're partners. After the event, dozens of people came up to talk. Many were scientists or students in scientific fields who'd been hiding their faith. Others were people of faith who'd been told science threatened their beliefs. One young woman, probably early 20s, waited until everyone else had left. "Dr. Reeves, I'm a biology major. I want to go to grad school, maybe become a professor, but I'm afraid that if I'm open about being a Christian, I won't be taken seriously, that I'll be seen as intellectually weak." That fear is valid. The academy can be hostile to faith. But here's what I've learned. Living a lie is worse than facing hostility. I spent 20 years pretending faith was irrelevant. It made me successful but miserable. Now I'm being honest, and yes, it's cost me. But I'm doing work that matters. Work that's true. Work that integrates all of who I am instead of just the parts that are professionally acceptable. So you think I should be open about my faith? I think you should be authentic. That might mean being strategic about when and how you share your beliefs. But don't hide who you are, just to fit in. The world needs scientists who can speak to both faith and reason, who can show they're not incompatible. Maybe you're called to be that bridge. Around this time, I reconnected with someone from my past, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a colleague from my UCLA days who I dated briefly before the accident. We'd ended things amicably when it became clear we wanted different futures. She wanted marriage and family. I wanted to focus solely on career. She reached out via email. "Nathan, I read your article. I had to reach out. What you described, encountering God, having your worldview transformed, it resonated with something I've been experiencing too. I've been afraid to talk about it because of how the department would react. But reading your story gave me courage. Can we meet for coffee?" We met at a cafe near UCLA. She looked the same, brilliant, thoughtful, still uncomfortable with small talk. "I've been having experiences I can't explain materialistically," she said. "Not as dramatic as yours, but persistent. A sense of being called to something beyond just research and publication. A hunger for meaning that neuroscience can't satisfy. And I've been dismissing it because that's what we're trained to do. But Nathan, what if we're dismissing something real? I spent 20 years dismissing it, and I was wrong. The hunger for meaning isn't evidence that meaning is illusory. It's evidence that we're made for something beyond just material existence. So what do? I can't leave UCLA like you did. I have tenure, a lab, responsibilities, but I can't keep pretending these experiences don't matter. Start small. Start being honest in safe spaces. Find others who are wrestling with the same questions. Read people who integrate faith and science. Give yourself permission to explore without having to have all the answers figured out. Are you happy with the choice you made? Leaving UCLA, going to Biola, being public about your faith. Happy isn't quite the right word. It's been hard. I lost friends, lost reputation, lost the career I'd built. But I'm at peace in a way I never was before. I'm doing work that means something. I'm living with integrity. I'm not hiding half of reality to please materialist gatekeepers. So yes, I'm happy. More than happy, I'm alive in a way I wasn't before. Before we parted, she said something that surprised me. "I'm going to start attending church. I haven't been to church since I was a kid, but I need community around these questions. I need people who can help me explore faith without judgment. Do you have any recommendations?" I gave her the name of the church where I'd spoken. They're thoughtful. They welcome questions. They understand that faith is a journey, not a destination. And Jennifer, I'm proud of you for being brave enough to explore this, for not dismissing experiences just because they don't fit your paradigm. My book was published in early spring. The Ex-Atheist hit bookstores with modest expectations. This wasn't going to be a bestseller, just a niche book for people interested in faith science questions, but it resonated more than anyone expected. Within a month, it was climbing the Christian book charts. Within 3 months, it had crossed over to secular audiences, people curious about how a scientist could believe in God, what evidence had convinced me, how I reconciled faith with reason. I was invited to debates. Skeptic conferences wanted me to explain my conversion. Christian conferences wanted me to defend faith intellectually. Universities wanted me to lecture on consciousness and spirituality. One particular debate was with my former self, in a sense. Dr. Richard Morrison agreed to a public conversation about whether consciousness required God. It was held at UCLA in a packed auditorium where I'd lectured many times as an atheist. Morrison made the materialist case eloquently. We can explain consciousness through neuroscience. We don't need supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. Adding God doesn't solve any problems. It just adds unnecessary complexity. When my turn came, I said, Dr. Morrison is right that we can describe neural correlates of consciousness, but description isn't explanation. We can map which brain regions activate during conscious experience, but we still can't explain why there's subjective experience at all, why there's something it's like to be conscious. That's the hard problem, and materialism hasn't solved it. Faith offers a different framework, that consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, that we're spiritual beings having material experiences rather than material beings creating the illusion of spiritual experience. But that's just God of the gaps reasoning, Morrison countered. Whenever science can't explain something, you insert God. That's intellectually lazy. It would be if that's what I was doing. But I'm not arguing for God because materialism has gaps. I'm arguing for God because I encountered him, because I had an experience that materialism can't account for, but faith can. That's not God of the gaps, that's following evidence. Subjective experience isn't evidence. It's anecdote. It's not replicable, not testable, not scientific. But it's still real, and a worldview that can't account for real experiences isn't adequate. Yes, my experience is subjective, but consciousness itself is subjective. First-person experience is the only way to access it. So dismissing subjective evidence in discussions of consciousness is dismissing the very thing we're trying to explain. The debate went on for 2 hours. Neither of us convinced the other. But afterward, several people approached me to say thank you for showing that faith could engage intellectually with science, that you didn't have to abandon reason to believe in God, that honest inquiry could lead to different conclusions than materialism. One person in particular stuck with me, a graduate student, probably mid-20s, who waited until everyone else had left. Dr. Reeves, I'm where you were. A neuroscience PhD student, committed atheist, convinced materialism explains everything. But I had an experience 6 months ago that I can't explain. And I've been trying to dismiss it because acknowledging it would mean questioning everything I've built my career on. Tell me about it. My grandmother died. I was with her at the end. And right before she passed, she said she saw something, someone. She said Jesus was in the room reaching out to her. And Dr. Reeves, I felt it too. Just for a moment. A presence, a love, something beyond the material. And I've been trying to explain it away ever since because admitting it was real would change everything. What if you stopped trying to explain it away? What if you let it be what it was? Then I'd have to admit I might be wrong about everything, that materialism might not be adequate, that there might be more than just neurons and matter, and that's terrifying. I know, I've been there. But here's what I learned. Being wrong isn't the worst thing. Living a lie is worse. Denying truth to protect your worldview is worse. Having to rebuild your understanding of reality is hard, but it's better than continuing to live in a framework you know is incomplete. How do I even start? The same way I did, with honesty, admitting to yourself that you had an experience you can't explain, being open to the possibility that your worldview might need expanding, finding people who've walked this path before you, reading, praying, exploring, not rushing to conclusions, but not dismissing evidence just because it's inconvenient. I gave him my contact information, recommended books, offered to meet again. And as he walked away, I felt overwhelming gratitude. This was why I'd gone public with my story. Not to convince anyone, but to give permission to people who'd had similar experiences, but were afraid to admit it. That night I wrote in my journal, a practice I'd started in the hospital and maintained ever since. 8 months since the accident. 8 months since God spoke to me in that hospital room. 8 months of transformation, of learning, of discovering what faith looks like for someone who spent 20 years fighting against it. I've lost things. My position at UCLA, my reputation in secular neuroscience, friends who can't understand my conversion. But I've gained more than I've lost. Peace, purpose, community, truth, work that matters, a life that's aligned with reality rather than at war with it. The ex-atheist is still learning, still figuring out what faith means, still integrating science and spirituality, still making mistakes and discovering grace. But I'm alive, truly alive, not just existing, but living with eyes open to the fullness of reality, to the material world that science explores and the spiritual world that faith encounters. Thank you, God, for the accident that woke me up, for the encounter that changed everything, for the journey you've led me on, even when it's been costly. Use me however you want. I'm yours. The journey from lab to faith continued, not as a destination reached, but as a path walked, day by day, choice by choice, truth by truth. And I was learning that the integration of faith and reason wasn't just intellectually possible, it was life-giving. It made me more fully human, not less. More complete, not divided. The ex-atheist had found his calling, and he was just getting started. 1 year after the accident, I stood in front of a mirror getting ready for a television interview. CNN wanted to do a segment on scientists who were people of faith, and my book had made me a visible example. I looked at my reflection, still recognizably me, but fundamentally different. The angry certainty that used to define my face had been replaced by something softer, humility maybe, or peace. My phone buzzed, a text from my father. Watching tonight, so proud of you, not because you're on TV, but because you're living with integrity. Love you, son. The interview was at a studio in downtown LA. The host, a sharp journalist named Amanda Chen, had done her homework. She'd read my book, watched my debates, knew my story. Dr. Reeves, you were a prominent atheist. You wrote a book called Consciousness Without God. You gave lectures explaining why belief was irrational. What happened? I encountered something I couldn't explain away. In a hospital, recovering from a near-fatal accident, I experienced a presence that was undeniably real. And that experience challenged everything I'd built my worldview on. But you're a neuroscientist. You know the brain can create these experiences, temporal lobe activity, endorphin release, stress responses. How do you know it wasn't just your brain creating what you needed to feel? I don't, with absolute certainty. But here's what I learned. The fact that the brain has mechanisms for experiencing something doesn't mean that something isn't real. We have mechanisms for seeing, but that doesn't mean the external world is an illusion. We have mechanisms for experiencing love, but that doesn't mean love isn't real. So why should spiritual experience be held to a different standard? But religious experience is subjective. It's not testable, not replicable. How is that scientific? Consciousness itself is subjective. The hard problem of consciousness, why there's subjective experience at all, remains unsolved. We can map neural correlates, but we can't explain why those correlates produce experience. So if we're studying consciousness, we have to take subjective experience seriously, and spiritual experience is a type of subjective experience. It's data that needs to be accounted for. What do your former colleagues think about your conversion? Most think I had a breakdown. Some think I'm being intellectually dishonest for professional gain, though I don't know what gain there is in leaving a prestigious position at UCLA for a teaching job at a Christian university. A few have reached out privately to say they've had similar experiences but are afraid to admit it publicly. Why afraid? Because the academy is often hostile to faith. There's an assumption that if you believe in God, you can't be a rigorous scientist, that faith and reason are incompatible. But that's not true. Some of the greatest scientists in history were people of faith. They saw their scientific work as exploring God's creation. Faith and science ask different questions. Science asks how things work. Faith asks why they exist and what they mean. Those questions aren't contradictory. They're complementary. The interview aired that evening. Within hours, my inbox was flooded. Hundreds of emails. Some were supportive, people thanking me for being public about faith, for showing that you could be intellectually rigorous and spiritually open. Others were hostile, former atheist allies accusing me of betraying the movement, of giving ammunition to creationists, of setting back the cause of reason. One email in particular caught my attention. From Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, a prominent atheist philosopher I debated years ago. Nathan, I watched your interview. I need to tell you something I've never told anyone publicly. I've had similar experiences. 3 times in my life, I felt something I can only describe as a presence, something beyond myself, something I've spent years explaining away because acknowledging it would mean questioning everything I've built my career on. Your honesty is making me reconsider whether I've been intellectually honest with myself. I'm not ready to convert or anything like that. But I'm ready to admit I might not have all the answers. Thank you for your courage. I responded immediately, offering to talk if she wanted. We scheduled a video call for the following week. Meanwhile, my work at Biola was expanding. The success of my book had brought attention to the university's approach to integrating faith and science. We were developing a new research center, the Center for Neuroscience and Spiritual Formation, focused on studying the intersection of brain science and spiritual experience. The funding came from an unexpected source, a tech billionaire named Robert Chen, who'd made his fortune in Silicon Valley and then had a spiritual awakening that transformed his priorities. He'd read my book and wanted to support research that took spiritual experience seriously. I was an atheist for 40 years, he told me during our first meeting. Built my career on pure rationality, pure materialism. Then I had an experience I couldn't explain, and instead of dismissing it, I followed it. It led me to faith, changed everything. Now I want to use my resources to help others who are on that same journey, to support research that doesn't start with the assumption that God doesn't exist. His donation, $5 million, enabled us to hire 3 more faculty, equip a state-of-the-art lab, and fund graduate students. We were doing real neuroscience research, but with different philosophical assumptions than most secular labs. We weren't trying to explain away spiritual experience, we were trying to understand it. Our first major project studied contemplative prayer. We had monks, nuns, and lay practitioners who'd spent decades in prayer practice. We used fMRI and EEG to map what was happening in their brains during deep prayer states. The results were fascinating, patterns of neural activity that were distinct from normal rest states or focused attention, but that correlated with reported experiences of divine presence. This doesn't prove God exists, I told my research team, but it does show that spiritual experience has a distinct neural signature, that it's not just random brain activity or wishful thinking. There's something real happening here, even if we can't fully explain it with our current neuroscience tools. One of my graduate students, Marcus, raised a concern. But couldn't skeptics say we're just mapping the neural mechanisms of delusion? That we're showing how the brain creates the illusion of divine encounter? They could say that. They probably will say that. But that interpretation assumes its conclusion, that divine encounter is impossible, so any experience of it must be illusory. We're working with a different set of assumptions, that if God exists, we'd expect to find that human brains are capable of encountering Him. And that's what we're seeing, neural mechanisms that facilitate genuine spiritual experience, not mechanisms that create false ones. Around this time, Jennifer Walsh reached out again. She'd been attending the church I'd recommended, had been exploring faith, and wanted to talk about her journey. We met for coffee near campus. She looked lighter somehow, less burdened. "I'm not where you are yet," she said. "I haven't had the dramatic encounter you had, but I've been experiencing something gradual, a slow opening to possibility, a recognition that maybe there's more than materialism can account for. That's how it works for many people. Not everyone gets the Damascus Road experience. Most people journey slowly through questions and doubts and small encounters that accumulate over time. I'm reading the Bible. It's strange. I read it as a teenager and found it boring and judgmental. Now I'm reading it and finding beauty, wisdom, depth. It's like I'm reading a different book. You're reading with different eyes. When you approach it looking for ammunition to dismiss it, you find that. When you approach it looking for truth, you find that instead. The text hasn't changed. You have. "There's something else," she said hesitantly. "I've been praying, just simple prayers. Talking to God like He might actually be listening, and Nathan, I think He is. Nothing dramatic, just a sense of presence. Like I'm not talking to empty air." That's how it starts. With small recognitions, with moments of presence, with the slow realization that maybe you're not alone after all. I'm scared, though. Scared of what this means for my career if I'm open about it. Scared of what my colleagues will think. Scared of becoming one of those Christians who abandon reason for emotion. You won't. That's the fear talking. You can be intellectually rigorous and a person of faith. They're not mutually exclusive. And Jennifer, the cost of honesty is worth it, I promise you that. Living authentically is better than living with approval, but without integrity. The academic year ended with a symposium I'd organized, Consciousness and the Divine, New Perspectives from Neuroscience. We brought together scientists, philosophers, and theologians to discuss how different disciplines approach questions of consciousness, spiritual experience, and the possibility of the transcendent. The keynote speaker was someone I never thought I'd share a stage with, Dr. Thomas Nagel, the philosopher who'd written What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, the classic paper on consciousness. He wasn't religious, but he'd argued for years that materialism was inadequate to explain consciousness. Consciousness poses a profound challenge to reductionist materialism, he said in his keynote. The subjective, first-person character of experience cannot be captured by objective, third-person descriptions of neural processes. This doesn't necessarily prove that consciousness is supernatural, but it does suggest that our ontology may need to be broader than pure materialism allows. Perhaps we need to recognize that mind, or something like it, is a fundamental feature of reality, rather than merely an emergent property of matter. During the Q&A, someone asked him directly, "Do you believe in God?" "I don't," he said. "But I recognize that theism offers resources for understanding consciousness that materialism doesn't. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, if it's a basic feature of reality rather than a late-arriving accident, then perhaps the theistic idea that consciousness, in the form of God, is the ground of all being deserves serious consideration, even from those of us who don't embrace it." After the symposium, we had dinner, a small group of speakers continuing the conversation informally. Nagel turned to me and said, "Your story is compelling, Nathan. Not because it's unusual, many intelligent people have spiritual experiences, but because you're being intellectually honest about it rather than dismissing it to preserve your materialist commitments. That takes courage." It also took losing everything I'd built. I'm not sure I would have had the courage without the accident forcing my hand. Perhaps. But you made the choice to follow where the experience led rather than explain it away. Many people in your position would have chosen differently, would have protected their career over their integrity. You didn't. That matters. That summer, 18 months after the accident, I received news that changed everything again. My book had been selected for a major award, the Templeton Prize for Progress in Research on Spiritual Realities. It came with a substantial monetary prize, but more importantly, with recognition that work integrating science and spirituality could be rigorous and valuable. The ceremony was in London. My parents flew over with me, the first time we'd traveled together since I was a child. Standing before an international audience of scientists, philosophers, and religious leaders, I accepted the award with gratitude and humility. "I don't deserve this," I said in my acceptance speech. 2 years ago, I was mocking people who believed in God. I was building my career on explaining away spiritual experience. I was intellectually arrogant and spiritually closed. Then I had an accident that forced me to confront the inadequacy of my worldview, and in a hospital room I encountered someone that I couldn't deny or dismiss. That encounter changed everything. This award isn't for being right, it's for being honest, for admitting I was wrong, for following truth even when it cost me everything I'd built. And if I can offer one piece of wisdom to the young scientists here tonight, don't let ideology, whether materialist or religious, keep you from following evidence wherever it leads. Be intellectually humble enough to admit when your worldview is inadequate. Be courageous enough to pursue truth even when it contradicts what you've believed. That's what real science requires. That's what real faith requires. That's what real integrity requires. After the ceremony, I was approached by a young woman, probably mid-20s, wearing a name tag identifying her as a doctoral student in neuroscience at Cambridge. "Dr. Reeves, I needed to hear your speech tonight. I've been having spiritual experiences for 3 years. Experiences I've been trying to explain away because I thought being a scientist meant being an atheist. But listening to you, realizing that honest inquiry can lead to faith rather than away from it, it's given me permission to stop dismissing what I'm experiencing and start exploring it." "What kind of experiences?" I asked. "Moments of presence, of being known and loved by something beyond myself, feelings during prayer that I'm not just talking to myself, a hunger for meaning that neuroscience can't satisfy. I've been calling it stress or loneliness or wishful thinking. But what if it's something real? What if I've been encountering God and dismissing it because my worldview couldn't accommodate it? Then you have a choice. You can keep dismissing it to preserve your materialist commitments, or you can follow it and see where it leads. I chose the second path. It cost me my position at UCLA, my reputation in secular neuroscience, friendships with colleagues, but I gained something more valuable. I gained truth, authenticity, peace, a life aligned with reality rather than at war with it. I'm scared. I was too, still am sometimes, but fear of consequences isn't a good reason to deny truth. Be honest about what you're experiencing. Find others who are wrestling with the same questions. Give yourself permission to explore without having to have all the answers figured out. That's all any of us can do. Flying home from London, sitting between my parents at 35,000 feet, I reflected on the journey of the past 18 months, from militant atheist to ex-atheist, from close-minded materialist to someone who could integrate faith and reason, from isolated and empty to connected and whole. The transformation wasn't complete. I still had questions, still struggled sometimes with doubt, still made mistakes as I learned what faith looked like for someone who'd spent 20 years fighting against it. But I was becoming someone new, someone who'd encountered truth and had the courage to follow it, someone who could hold scientific rigor and spiritual openness together rather than treating them as enemies, someone who was learning that the fullness of reality included both the material world that science explored and the spiritual world that faith encountered. My father reached over and squeezed my hand. Your mother and I are so proud of you, not because of the award or the recognition, but because you're living with integrity, because you followed truth even when it cost you everything. That's real courage. I learned it from you. You taught me that truth matters more than comfort. I just took a long detour through atheism before I figured out what truth actually was. Maybe you needed that detour. Maybe you needed to reject faith so completely that when you came back to it, it was yours rather than ours, your own encounter rather than inherited belief. He was right. This faith wasn't my parents' faith recycled. It was my own, born from encounter rather than indoctrination, tested through fire rather than assumed through tradition, integrated with reason rather than held in opposition to it. The ex-atheist had become something new, not just a believer, but a bridge. Someone who could speak to both the scientific and spiritual communities, who could show them they weren't enemies, but partners in understanding the fullness of reality. That was my calling now, and I was ready to embrace it fully. Whatever came next, I'd face it with faith and reason working together, with humility and courage, with integrity and authenticity. The journey from lab to faith continued, not as a destination reached, but as a path walked, day by day, truth by truth, encounter by encounter. And I was grateful, so deeply grateful, for every step of it, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones, because they'd led me here, to truth, to peace, to life abundant, to God. 2 years after the accident, I was invited back to UCLA. Not to resume my position, that door was closed, but to give a guest lecture in the very auditorium where I'd once taught that consciousness required no God. That meaning was illusory, that faith was intellectual weakness. The invitation came from Dr. Morrison himself. Nathan, I don't agree with your conclusions, but I respect your intellectual honesty, and I think our students need to hear from someone who's traveled the path from atheism to faith without abandoning rigorous thinking. Would you be willing to speak? I accepted, knowing it would be controversial, knowing some of my former colleagues would protest, knowing the lecture would be either a disaster or a breakthrough. There was no middle ground. The auditorium was packed. Students filled every seat, lined the walls, sat in the aisles. Some came out of curiosity, the ex-atheist returning to his old stomping grounds. Others came with hostility, ready to challenge, to expose what they saw as intellectual betrayal. A few came with hunger, desperate to hear that the journey from doubt to faith was possible without sacrificing reason. I stood at the podium, where I'd once declared God unnecessary, and began. 2 years ago, I stood here teaching you that consciousness was nothing more than neurons firing, that the soul was an illusion, that belief in God was intellectual cowardice. I was certain, absolutely certain, and I was wrong. I'm not here to tell you that you should believe in God. I'm not here to convert anyone or to argue that faith is the only rational conclusion. I'm here to tell you my story, about how a neuroscientist who spent 20 years explaining away spiritual experience had an encounter he couldn't dismiss, and about what I learned from that encounter. The first thing I learned is that certainty is often arrogance in disguise. I thought I had consciousness figured out, thought I understood the relationship between mind and matter, thought I knew that materialism was true and theism was false. But I'd made a fundamental error. I'd assumed my conclusion and then interpreted all evidence through that assumption. That's not science, that's ideology. Real intellectual humility requires being open to evidence that contradicts your worldview, even when that evidence is experiential rather than empirical, even when following that evidence costs you professionally and socially, even when it means admitting you were wrong about something fundamental. The second thing I learned is that the hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved. We can map neural correlates. We can describe which brain regions activate during different mental states, but we still can't explain why there's subjective experience at all. why there's something it's like to be conscious. Materialism has tools for describing the physical, but consciousness is inherently non-physical. It's subjective, first-person, qualitative. And no amount of third-person, objective, quantitative description can bridge that explanatory gap. Some of you are thinking, but we'll solve it eventually. With better tools, better theories, we'll reduce consciousness to purely physical processes. Maybe, but we've been trying for decades, and the hard problem remains as hard as ever. At some point, we have to consider the possibility that consciousness can't be reduced because it's fundamental rather than emergent. That mind isn't a late-arriving accident in a material universe, but a basic feature of reality. And if consciousness is fundamental, then the theistic idea that consciousness, in the form of God, is the ground of all being starts to look less like superstition and more like a serious philosophical position worthy of consideration. The third thing I learned is that spiritual experience is real data. Not the only data, not necessarily the most important data, but data nonetheless. First-person experiential data, and in discussions of consciousness, which is itself subjective experience, first-person data is essential. To dismiss it because it's not empirically verifiable is to dismiss the very thing we're trying to understand. I had an experience in a hospital room 2 years ago, an encounter with a presence I can only describe as divine, a love so overwhelming it shattered my defenses, a knowing so deep it bypassed all my intellectual arguments. And that experience is data. I can't prove it to you, can't replicate it in a lab, can't give you objective verification, but I know it was real. More real than anything I'd experienced before. Now, you can explain my experience materialistically. You can say it was temporal lobe activity, endorphin release, trauma response, and you'd have neural mechanisms to point to. But having mechanisms doesn't mean the experience isn't genuine. We have mechanisms for seeing, but that doesn't mean the external world is an illusion. We have mechanisms for loving, but that doesn't mean love isn't real. So why should spiritual experience be different? The fourth thing I learned is that faith and reason aren't enemies, they're partners. Science asks how. How does the universe work? How do physical processes unfold? How can we predict and control natural phenomena? Faith asks why. Why does anything exist at all? Why is there order rather than chaos? Why are we capable of grasping truth about the universe? These questions aren't contradictory, they're complementary. And the greatest scientists in history understood this. Newton, Kepler, Faraday, Maxwell, Mendel, all were people of faith who saw their scientific work as exploring God's creation. The split between faith and science is relatively recent. It's ideological, not necessary. And it's impoverishing both communities. Science without openness to the transcendent becomes a cramped materialism that can't account for the fullness of human experience. Faith without intellectual rigor becomes anti-intellectual dogmatism that fears questions and evidence. But integrated, faith and reason working together, you get a fuller picture of reality, material and spiritual, physical and metaphysical, how and why. The final thing I learned is that transformation is possible. I was a militant atheist, angry, certain, closed-minded. I mocked people who believed in God. I built my career on explaining why faith was irrational. And then I encountered something that changed everything. That encounter didn't destroy my intellect. It expanded it. Didn't make me less rational, made me more open to the full scope of rationality. Didn't diminish my scientific work, gave it deeper meaning and broader context. I'm still a neuroscientist, still doing research, publishing papers, teaching courses, but I'm doing science with different assumptions now. Not that material reality is all there is, but that material reality is real and important and also not exhaustive of reality. That consciousness might be more than just brain activity. That spiritual experience is real data worth investigating, that God might actually exist and be knowable through encounter. These aren't scientific conclusions in the narrow sense. They're philosophical frameworks that inform how I do science. And here's what I found. I'm doing better work now than I ever did as a materialist, because I'm not artificially constraining my inquiry. I'm following evidence wherever it leads. I'm open to the full range of human experience. I'm integrated rather than divided. So, what am I asking of you? Not to believe what I believe, not to have the same experience I had, but to be intellectually honest, to recognize when your worldview might be inadequate, to be open to evidence that contradicts your assumptions, to have the courage to follow truth even when it costs you. That's what real science requires. That's what real integrity requires. That's what I'm trying to model imperfectly as I continue this journey. I opened it up for questions, expecting hostility. And some questions were hostile. Accusations of betraying science, of giving ammunition to creationists, of abandoning reason for emotion. But other questions were different, sincere, hungry. How do you respond to the criticism that you're just experiencing confirmation bias, seeing what you want to see? I'd have more sympathy for that criticism if I'd wanted to see God, but I didn't. I spent 20 years not wanting God to exist. I'd built my entire career on his non-existence. Confirmation bias works when you're looking for something you want to find. I found something I explicitly didn't want to find. That actually makes the experience more credible, not less. What would falsify your belief? What evidence would convince you that you were wrong? That's a fair question, and here's my honest answer. I don't know. My belief isn't based on an argument that could be refuted. It's based on an encounter that was self-evidently real. It's like asking, what would convince you that you're not actually conscious right now? I know I'm conscious because I'm experiencing consciousness. Similarly, I know God is real because I've encountered him, not as an inference, but as a direct experience. Now you can say that makes my belief unfalsifiable, and you'd be right in one sense. But consciousness itself is unfalsifiable in the same way. I can't prove to you that I'm conscious. I can only report my experience and trust that you believe me because you have similar experiences. Faith works the same way. It's experiential knowledge rather than inferential knowledge. But don't you worry that you're abandoning the scientific worldview? I'm not abandoning science. I'm expanding it, recognizing its legitimate domain, investigating the material world, while also recognizing its limitations. It can't address questions of ultimate meaning, purpose, or spiritual reality. Those aren't scientific questions. They're philosophical and theological questions, and they deserve rigorous inquiry too, just with different methods than empirical investigation. After the lecture, I was surrounded by students. Some wanted to argue. Others wanted to share their own struggles with doubt, with secret spiritual experiences they'd been afraid to acknowledge, with the tension between what they'd been taught and what they'd experienced. One student in particular stayed until everyone else had left, a young man, probably early 20s, with tears in his eyes. Dr. Reeves, I've been planning to kill myself. I've been so depressed, so convinced that life is meaningless, that there's no point to anything. Materialism tells me I'm just atoms, that consciousness is an illusion, that when I die I'll just cease to exist. And if that's true, why suffer? Why keep going? But listening to you tonight, hearing that maybe there's more, that maybe consciousness is fundamental, that maybe I'm more than just matter, it's given me a reason to keep living, to explore whether maybe there's meaning after all. Thank you. You saved my life tonight. I gave him my contact information, connected him with campus counseling resources, urged him to get professional help for the depression. But I also prayed with him right there in the auditorium. Awkward, fumbling prayer. I was still learning how to do this, but real, honest, from the heart. After he left, I sat alone in the empty auditorium thinking about how my story was rippling outward, about how honesty about my journey was giving others permission to be honest about theirs. about how the ex-atheist's testimony was becoming a bridge for people traveling from doubt to faith, from despair to hope, from materialism to a fuller understanding of reality. The next day, Dr. Morrison asked to meet for coffee. We sat in the same cafe where we'd had countless conversations during my time at UCLA. "Nathan, I need to tell you something. I've been wrestling with your story for 2 years now, trying to explain it materialistically, trying to maintain my certainty that you're experiencing neurological effects rather than genuine spiritual encounter, but I can't anymore." "Can't what?" "Can't maintain the certainty. You know me. I've been a committed materialist for 40 years, built my career on it, but watching your transformation, seeing the fruit of your experience, the peace, the purpose, the integration, I have to admit, something real happened to you. I don't know what. I'm not ready to call it God. But it wasn't just brain chemistry. It was something more. That's a significant admission coming from you." "It is, and I don't know what to do with it. I'm not ready to abandon materialism, but I'm also not as certain as I used to be. Your story, and your intellectual honesty about it, has created doubt where there was only certainty before. Doubt isn't the end, Dr. Morrison. It's the beginning. It's the crack that lets light in. Stay open to it, follow it, see where it leads. Like you did, like I did, and like hundreds of others have done. The journey from materialism to faith isn't easy, but it's honest, and in the end, honesty matters more than comfort." That week, I received an email that brought everything full circle. From Dr. Jennifer Walsh. "Nathan, I need to tell you something. I've been exploring faith for 2 years now, reading, praying, attending church, wrestling with questions, and last week, I had my own encounter, not as dramatic as yours, but real, undeniable. I was alone in my apartment praying, and I felt a presence, a love that knew everything about me and loved me anyway. And Nathan, I knew in that moment, God is real. This isn't just philosophy or wishful thinking. It's encounter. It's truth. I'm terrified about what this means for my career, but I'm also exhilarated. Because I've spent my entire adult life studying consciousness while missing the most important thing about it, that it's connected to a consciousness greater than our own, that we're spiritual beings, not just material ones, that there's someone who knows us and loves us and is reaching out to us. Thank you for being honest about your journey, for showing me this was possible, for giving me permission to follow truth wherever it led. I'm joining you on the ex-atheist path, and I'm grateful beyond words." I called her immediately. We talked for 2 hours about her experience, about what comes next, about how to navigate being a person of faith in secular neuroscience, and I felt overwhelming gratitude that my story had helped create space for hers. This was the ripple effect in action. One encounter leading to one testimony, leading to one person being honest, leading to others finding permission to be honest, leading to more encounters, more testimonies, more transformation. That weekend, I visited my parents. We'd grown close over the past 2 years, rebuilding what had been broken for 2 decades, and I wanted to thank them. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something. I spent 20 years angry at you for the rigid faith you'd given me, for the rules without relationship, the judgment without grace, the religion without love, and that anger drove me into militant atheism, into building my identity on rejecting everything you'd taught me. But I want you to know, you planted seeds even in your imperfection, seeds of truth about God, about meaning, about reality, being more than just matter. And when I encountered God in that hospital room, those seeds gave me categories for understanding what I was experiencing, language for articulating encounter, framework for integrating faith and reason. So thank you, not for doing everything right. You didn't, and neither have I. But for planting seeds that bore fruit 20 years later, for praying for me even when I'd cut you off, for being there when I needed you, for showing me that faith could be real and vibrant instead of just rigid and judgmental. You saved me in ways you'll never fully understand. My mother was crying. My father was trying not to. We held each other for a long time, family restored, relationship rebuilt, love flowing freely instead of being blocked by ideology and anger. That evening, I sat in their backyard looking at the stars. The same stars I'd looked at as a child when they told me God created everything. The same stars I'd looked at as an adult atheist when I'd thought they were just burning gas in an uncaring universe. The same stars that now filled me with wonder and worship. "Thank you," I whispered to the God who'd met me in a hospital room. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for pursuing me even when I was running, for using an accident to wake me up, for the journey you've led me on, for the people you've brought into my life, for the work you've given me to do. Use me however you want. Lead me wherever you're leading. I'm yours, completely yours." And in the silence that followed, I felt that familiar presence, not answering all my questions, not revealing the future, just being with me, holding me, loving me. That was enough. That would always be enough. The ex-atheist had come home, not to religion, but to relationship, not to dogma, but to encounter, not to certainty, but to trust. And the journey continued, day by day, truth by truth, encounter by encounter, leading me ever deeper into the heart of God. 3 years after the accident, I stood in my office at Biola, looking at a framed photo on my desk. It was from the day of the accident, my UCLA ID badge now expired, that I'd kept as a reminder of who I'd been. Next to it was another photo, me speaking at the Templeton Prize ceremony, my parents on either side, all of us smiling. The contrast was stark. The first photo showed a man who was certain, closed, alone. The second showed someone who was humble, open, connected. The journey between those two photos had cost me everything and given me more. My phone rang. A producer from a major streaming documentary series. They wanted to do an episode on my story, The Neuroscientist Who Found God. 6 months of filming, interviews with colleagues past and present, footage of my work at Biola, exploration of how my research had evolved. "We want to tell your story honestly," the producer said, "not as propaganda for either side, but as a genuine journey from materialism to faith. Show people that the path exists, that brilliant scientists can encounter God without abandoning reason." I agreed, knowing it would bring more scrutiny, more criticism, but also potentially help more people who were on the same journey. The documentary crew followed me for months. They filmed my lectures at Biola. They interviewed my students, who spoke about how my integration of faith and science had given them permission to be whole rather than divided. They talked to my parents about the 20 years of prayer, the reunion, the restoration. They interviewed Dr. Morrison at UCLA. To my surprise, he was remarkably honest. "Nathan's conversion forced me to question assumptions I'd held for 40 years, he told the camera. "I still don't believe in God, but I can no longer claim with certainty that God doesn't exist." Nathan's experience and his intellectual honesty about it showed me that I'd been just as dogmatic as the religious fundamentalists I'd criticized. I'd built an unfalsifiable worldview and mocked others for doing the same. That was humbling to realize. They interviewed Jennifer Walsh, who'd come out publicly as a Christian the previous year. "Nathan showed me it was possible," she said, "to be a rigorous scientist and a person of faith, to integrate reason and spirituality. His courage gave me courage. His honesty gave me permission to be honest. I'll always be grateful for that." They interviewed David Ashford, Sarah Chen, Michael Torres, all the people who'd been part of my journey, each telling their own story of how they'd navigated the path from doubt to faith without abandoning intellectual integrity. But the most powerful interview was with someone I didn't expect, the graduate student who'd approached me after my UCLA lecture 2 years ago, the one who'd been planning suicide. "Dr. Reeves saved my life," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I'd convinced myself that materialism was true and therefore life was meaningless. If consciousness is just neurons and death is just cessation, why suffer? Why keep going? But hearing him talk about consciousness as potentially fundamental, about spiritual experience as real, about the possibility that we're more than just matter, it gave me a reason to live, to explore whether maybe there's meaning after all. I started going to church, started praying, started reading, and 6 months ago I had my own encounter. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet knowing that I'm not alone, that I'm loved, that my life has purpose even when I can't see it. And now I'm not just surviving, I'm thriving. I'm doing my PhD in neuroscience, but with openness to the spiritual dimension of consciousness, following in Dr. Reeves's footsteps, trying to be a bridge between science and faith like he is. When the documentary aired, the response was overwhelming. Millions of viewers, thousands of emails, social media exploded with reactions, some hostile, many grateful, all passionate. The atheist community largely condemned it as propaganda, as giving credibility to superstition, as showing how even intelligent people can be deceived by emotional experiences. But even there, cracks appeared. Some prominent atheists admitted privately that they'd had similar experiences, but had been afraid to acknowledge them. The Christian community embraced it, though some fundamentalists were uncomfortable with my emphasis on evidence and reason rather than blind faith. They wanted testimony, not intellectual engagement, but most recognized that reaching secular audiences required meeting them where they were, with rigorous thinking and honest questioning, not just emotional appeals. But the most meaningful responses came from people in between. Scientists who'd been hiding their faith, students who'd thought they had to choose between intellectual integrity and spiritual openness, people who'd had encounters they'd been dismissing or explaining away. "I'm a physicist at Stanford," one email read. "I've been a closeted Christian for 15 years because I thought coming out would end my career. But watching your documentary, seeing your courage, hearing your story, I've decided to stop hiding, to be honest about integrating quantum mechanics and faith. Thank you for going first." Another: "I'm an undergraduate studying biology. I've been torn between my faith and my science classes for 2 years. Professors telling me evolution disproves God. Church leaders telling me science threatens faith. Your documentary showed me I don't have to choose. I can pursue both rigorously. You've given me hope." A particularly moving email came from an elderly man. "I'm 83 years old. I've been an atheist my whole life, a chemist by training, but 3 years ago, my wife died, and in my grief, I felt something I can't explain. A presence, a comfort, a sense that she wasn't just gone, but somehow held by something greater. I've been trying to dismiss it as wishful thinking, but your story gave me permission to take it seriously, to explore whether maybe there's more than materialism allows. At 83, I'm finally open to the possibility of God. Better late than never." The documentary also reignited academic debate. Several universities held symposiums on consciousness and spiritual experience, bringing together neuroscientists, philosophers, and theologians. The questions I'd been wrestling with were now being discussed openly in academic contexts where they'd previously been taboo. Stanford hosted one such symposium, and I was invited as a keynote speaker. The topic: "Can neuroscience and theology inform each other?" I argued yes. Neuroscience studies the mechanisms by which we experience reality, including spiritual reality. Theology studies the nature of the spiritual reality we're experiencing. These aren't competing explanations, they're complementary perspectives. Neuroscience tells us how the brain engages with God. Theology tells us who God is and what that engagement means. We need both for a full understanding. A prominent atheist neuroscientist challenged me, "But you're assuming God exists. That's not neutral scientific inquiry, that's apologetics disguised as research. And you're assuming God doesn't exist. That's not neutral either. That's materialist ideology disguised as science." The question is, which assumption better accounts for the full range of data, including first-person experiential data? I'm arguing that theism does. not because I started with that conclusion, but because that's where the evidence, including my own experience, led me. After the symposium, a young neuroscience professor approached me. "Dr. Reeves, I need to tell you something. I'm a Christian, have been my whole life, but I've been hiding it completely in my academic work, publishing only materialist interpretations, avoiding any hint of faith in my research. But watching you, seeing how you integrate both honestly, it's made me realize I've been living a lie. I'm going to start being authentic. Stop dividing myself into secular, professional, and private believer. Follow your example of integration. Just be prepared for the cost," I warned. "Integration is beautiful, but it's not easy. Some colleagues won't understand. Some will actively oppose you. You might lose opportunities, face discrimination, be labeled as intellectually compromised. I know, but isn't integrity worth that cost? Isn't living authentically better than living divided?" Yes, it is. I promise you that. That spring, 4 years after the accident, I received surprising news. UCLA wanted to establish a new research center, the Institute for Consciousness Studies, and they wanted me to co-direct it. The goal: bring together neuroscientists, philosophers, and theologians to study consciousness from multiple perspectives, without materialist assumptions constraining inquiry. We've realized that excluding spiritual perspectives from consciousness research was limiting our understanding. Dr. Morrison explained in the meeting. Your work at Biola, your documentary, the conversations you've sparked, they've shown us that we were artificially constraining our inquiry. We want to change that. We want to create space for rigorous investigation that's open to the full range of explanations, including spiritual ones. Would I have to leave Biola? No. We're envisioning a joint appointment. You'd teach at both institutions, do research at both, bridge both communities. We need someone who can speak both languages, secular and sacred, someone who has credibility in both worlds. That's you. It was a vindication of sorts. The institution that had pushed me out was now inviting me back. Not to recant my faith, but to bring it into dialogue with secular scholarship, not to choose between science and spirituality, but to integrate both. I accepted, seeing it as an opportunity to be the bridge I'd been called to be, to show both communities that they needed each other, that science without openness to the transcendent was impoverished, that faith without intellectual rigor was shallow, that together they could pursue truth more completely than either could alone. My first major project at the new institute was ambitious, a longitudinal study of people who'd had transformative spiritual experiences. We recruited 100 participants, some who'd converted from atheism like me, others who'd had mystical experiences within their existing faith traditions, still others who'd had encounters they couldn't categorize. We did comprehensive brain scans, psychological assessments, interviews, follow-ups over years. We wanted to understand what happens neurologically during spiritual transformation. How do these experiences change people long-term? Can we identify markers that distinguish genuine encounter from wishful thinking? The preliminary results were fascinating. People who reported transformative spiritual experiences showed lasting changes in brain structure, increased activity in regions associated with empathy and compassion, decreased activity in regions associated with self-focused thought and anxiety. Their psychological profiles showed increased well-being, sense of meaning, connection to others. This doesn't prove God exists, I told my research team, but it does show that spiritual experience has measurable lasting effects, that it's not just temporary emotional comfort, but genuine transformation, that something real is happening even if our tools can't fully capture what. One evening, working late at the UCLA lab, Dr. Morrison came to talk. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, but also somehow softer. "Nathan, I need to tell you something. I've been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4. 6 months to a year, they're saying." I felt my stomach drop. "Dr. Morrison, I'm so sorry. What can I do?" You can tell me honestly, do you really believe there's something after death, that consciousness continues, that we're more than just our bodies? I do, not because I can prove it empirically, but because I've encountered something that convinced me material existence isn't all there is, that consciousness is fundamental, that we're spiritual beings having material experiences, not material beings creating the illusion of spiritual experience. I want to believe that. I'm terrified of just ceasing to exist, of all this. He gestured around the lab, meaning nothing in the end, but I don't know how to believe. I've spent 60 years building my worldview on materialism. How do I let that go now? You start by being honest about your hunger for something more, about the inadequacy of materialism to address your deepest questions. And then you open yourself to the possibility that there might be someone reaching out to you. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be willing to explore. Will you help me? Walk with me through this? Of course, absolutely. Over the next months, I visited Dr. Morrison weekly. We talked about consciousness, about meaning, about death, about God. I brought him books, C.S. Lewis, Timothy Keller, Francis Collins. We prayed together, awkwardly at first, then more naturally, and slowly I watched transformation happen. The certain materialist softening into humble seeker, the closed atheist opening to possibility, the dying man finding hope in something beyond material existence. 3 months before he died, Dr. Morrison called me to his hospital room. "Nathan, I need to tell you something. I encountered him, God, just like you did. Not the same way. It was quieter, gentler, but real, undeniably real. And I know now I'm not just going to cease to exist. There's more. There's someone waiting for me. And I'm not afraid anymore." He died peacefully 6 weeks later, surrounded by family. At his funeral, I spoke about his journey, about a man who'd spent 60 years certain of materialism and his final year discovering something more. About intellectual honesty that allowed him to question even his most fundamental assumptions, about humility that admitted he might have been wrong about the most important questions. "Dr. Morrison taught me many things," I said. "How to be a rigorous scientist, how to think critically, how to follow evidence wherever it leads. But his final lesson was the most important. It's never too late to be open to truth, never too late to encounter God. Never too late to find hope in something beyond material existence." He died with peace I'd rarely seen in him while he lived, and that peace came from finally being open to someone he'd spent 60 years explaining away. After the funeral, dozens of people, colleagues, students, family, came up to thank me for walking with Dr. Morrison through his final journey, for showing him there was another way, for being patient with his questions and doubts. "You gave him permission to explore," his daughter said. "All his life, he was the certain professor who had all the answers. But at the end, you showed him it was okay to have questions, to doubt, to seek, and in seeking, he found. Thank you for that gift." 5 years after the accident, I published another book. Not a memoir this time, but academic work, Consciousness and the Divine, Toward an Integrated Neuroscience. It argued that consciousness science needed to expand beyond materialist assumptions, that spiritual experience was real data, requiring serious investigation, that theism offered resources for understanding consciousness that materialism couldn't provide. The book was controversial in secular neuroscience, but well received in broader academic circles. It sparked conversations, generated research, created space for perspectives that had been excluded from mainstream consciousness studies. I was invited to speak at universities around the world. Each venue brought new encounters, scientists hiding their faith, students struggling to integrate belief and reason, seekers hungry for permission to take spiritual experience seriously. And through it all, I kept returning to that hospital room, to the moment when God spoke to me, when presence overwhelmed me, when everything I thought I knew was challenged and ultimately transformed. That encounter had been the hinge point, the moment that separated my old life from my new one, the experience that made me into the ex-atheist. But it wasn't just the encounter that mattered. It was what I'd done with it. The choice to follow truth, even when it cost me. The courage to be honest, even when it was professionally dangerous. The humility to admit I'd been wrong. The integration of faith and reason rather than treating them as enemies. That's what made the journey meaningful. Not just having an experience, but having the courage to follow where it led. On the 5th anniversary of the accident, I drove to the intersection where it had happened. A completely ordinary place, just a busy LA intersection where thousands of cars passed daily. But for me, it was sacred ground. The place where my old life ended and my new life began. I stood there thinking about everything that had happened. The pain, the encounter, the transformation, the cost, the fruit, the relationships restored, the bridges built, the lives touched, the research that integrated rather than divided, the testimony that gave others permission to be honest. "Thank you," I whispered, "for the accident I never would have chosen, but that saved my life. For the encounter that changed everything, for the courage to follow where you led, for the journey you've walked with me, for using my story to help others find their way from doubt to faith, from materialism to fullness, from death to life. I don't know what comes next, don't know what the next 5 years hold, don't know how this story continues, but I know this: I'm yours, completely yours. Lead me wherever you're leading. Use me however you want. I'm listening. I'm following. I'm trusting." I felt that familiar presence, the same presence I'd encountered 5 years ago in a hospital room. Not giving answers, but giving himself. Not revealing the future, but being present in the now. And that was enough. That would always be enough. The ex-atheist had come home, had found what he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching, had encountered truth that was both intellectually rigorous and spiritually alive, had become a bridge between communities that thought they were enemies. The journey from lab to faith was complete in one sense. I'd made the crossing. I'd left atheism behind, embraced faith, integrated both with reason. But in another sense, it was just beginning. Because now came the work of living it out, of continuing the research, of helping others make the same journey, of being faithful to the calling I'd been given, of showing the world that you don't have to choose between faith and reason, that brilliant scientists can believe in God without abandoning their intellect. That spiritual experience is real and worthy of serious investigation. That consciousness might be more than neurons, meaning more than illusion, life more than matter, that there's someone reaching out to all of us. Someone who speaks in hospital rooms and quiet prayers and transformative encounters. Someone who meets us where we are and leads us into fullness. I got back in my car and drove to Biola, where I had a class to teach, neuroscience and the soul. 28 students eager to learn how to integrate faith and science, how to be whole rather than divided. As I walked across campus, I felt profound gratitude for the accident that woke me up, for the encounter that changed me, for the courage God gave me to follow truth wherever it led, for every person He'd brought into my life on this journey, for the calling to be a bridge. The ex-atheist was living his purpose, doing work that mattered, helping others find what he'd found, showing them the path was possible, and he would continue. Day by day, truth by truth, encounter by encounter, until the day when the faith he'd embraced would become sight, when the presence he'd learned to recognize would become face-to-face encounter, when the journey would reach its completion in the arms of the God who'd never let him go. Until then, he would keep walking, keep testifying, keep bridging, keep loving, because that's what the ex-atheist had been called to do. And by God's grace, that's what he would keep doing, always.